Call the meeting to order. May I get a roll call?
Councilmember Syak. Councilmember Spector.
Here.
Councilmember Rennie.
Here.
Vice Mayor Jensen.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Leonardis.
Here. All right, I'd like to bring Chloe Yang up for the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm going to say a few words about Chloe. Chloe, can you come here? You're out of breath already. All right, this is Chloe Yang. She's a kindergartner from Daves Avenue Elementary School. Chloe likes to read and write and doing math puzzles and drawing. Chloe practices swimming 2 times a week all year round. Chloe is also learning how to play tennis. During the fall and winter, Chloe plays basketball in the Calvary League in Los Gatos, Calvary Church Basketball League. For community service, Chloe exchanges letters with her preschool friends at Harker and a friend who lives in Shanghai, where she first met in the Los Gatos Public Library. That's kind of neat. Chloe also visits Kitty Campus with her brother, who I think we've seen, to read and do hands-on fun science with preschoolers. So how about a hand of applause for Chloe, everybody? All right, and Chloe, I want you to turn towards the flag, and here's the microphone. You're going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, okay? Go ahead. Speak into the microphone.
Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good job, Chloe. So I want you to go and shake hands with the council members over here. Right there. And shake hands with Marcia Jensen. We have a gift for you to share with your brother, okay? You did a great job. Thank you for coming in. Shake hands with him. She is simply adorable. A round of applause for Chloe Yang. Thank you. Next item of business is to approve the certification of the November 6th election. And we have to adopt a resolution certifying the results of Measure G and the three town council seats that were in the election for November 6th. So, do we have to do a motion on this? Okay. Vice Mayor Marcia Jensen.
Move that we certify the election results from November of 2018 as stated in our staff report.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. Moving on to swearing in of the new council. And we are going to do this from the dais, and our clerk, Shannon Lombardo, will be swearing us in. May I ask Mr. Rennie and Ms. Sayak to stand and raise your right hands.
All right, repeat after me, please. I state your name.
I, Stephen Leonardis,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties upon which I am about to enter.
the duties upon which I am about to enter. All right. Thank you. Thank you for all those who voted in the election. Moving on to our closed session report.
Yes, good evening. Prior to tonight's regular session, councilmen in closed session to discuss real property negotiations, specifically the property on Tate Street. No action was taken that requires reporting under the Brown Act.
Thank you. Next item is our consent calendar. We have a large consent calendar consisting of about 14 items this evening. Does any member of council wish to pull an item from our consent calendar? Vice Mayor.
I would like to pull number 5. I have scheduling issues.
Okay, so item 5 will be pulled. Councilmember Sayoc.
May I pull item 6?
Item number 5 and 6 are pulled. Any others? Any member of the public wishes to pull an item from the consent calendar that has not already been pulled? Seeing none, we will take a vote on the consent calendar exclusive of items 5 and 6. Vice Mayor.
Move approval of the consent calendar consisting of items 1 through 15, exclusive of items 5 and 6.
Second.
I think that would be items 1 through 14.
14, sorry.
So we have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. We will hear items 5 and 6 after item 17 on our agenda this evening. Moving along to verbal communications. If anybody wishes to speak to the council this evening for an item which is not on the agenda, please submit a card at this time. I do have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 cards for item number 6 and 1 card for verbal communications. Mr. John Shepherdson, please come forward. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is for the overhead. This is from the CAL FIRE website, and it was kind of alarming to me. And this is the red there. It recognizes that portion of the state. It's very high risk of fire, and it struck me that in the middle of that, this is Butte County, is Paradise. So then I went and looked for Santa Clara County, and in particular Los Gatos. And this is what showed up, that about half of Los Gatos is in the same risk factor that Paradise is. And so I wanted to share those facts and perhaps encourage the fullest extent possible by the town to address that risk, because it will be ongoing, and as the climate continues to warm up, that risk will, in my view, get greater. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherdson. Any questions for the speaker? Seeing none, we will go on to our first public hearing this evening under other business, item number 15, which is approving an amendment to the employment agreement between the town of Los Gatos and the town manager and authorizing salary and benefits adjustments in the amount of $18,103 from estimates available from the 1819 operating revenues. Do we have a staff report? Mrs. Velasco.
Good evening. Thank you. Lisa Velasco, Human Resources Director. Before you tonight is a recommendation to formally approve amendments to the employment agreement for the town manager. In compliance with Senate Bill 1436, a summary of the modifications to the amendment include a base salary increase to $236,250 annually, a one-time lump sum bonus of $3,300. I'm available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from council at this time? Seeing none, I don't have any speaker cards on this item, so I will go ahead and close the public hearing and look for a motion from the Vice Mayor.
I make a motion that we approve an amendment to the employment agreement between the town of Los Gatos and its town manager, as reflected from Ms. Velasco and in our staff report and in attachment 1 to our staff report.
All right, I'll second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. Passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 16, conditional use permit application U18-008, project location 720 Blossom Hill Road. And this is regarding Lenardi's Supermarket requesting approval for modification of an existing conditional use permit to allow wine and beer tasting on a property zoned C1. Mr. Mullen is presenting our staff report.
Thank you. Before you tonight is a request to modify a conditional use permit to allow wine and beer tasting at Lenardi's Supermarket. The proposed wine and beer tasting would be located within an interior space currently used for storage. No exterior modifications or increase in floor area would occur as a result. In addition to town requirements, the proposed use would be regulated under a Type 86 license issued by the California Alcoholic Beverage Control. The Planning Commission considered the request on October 10th of this year and forwarded a recommendation of approval to the Town Council with one modified condition to limit tastings to no more than 2 consecutive hours and no more than once per day. This concludes staff's presentation, and we are available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. We have a question from Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mullen, do you know, are we expecting an applicant?
The applicant emailed earlier this afternoon, and they had a scheduling conflict and couldn't be available. They were trying to find a replacement, but I did not get another email telling me whether someone would be here.
So to the town attorney, then we rely on the testimony that we have in the transcript of the Planning Commission?
Yes, that's correct. We don't have anything that requires the applicant to be present.
Thank you.
More questions for staff? Seeing none, at this time we'll open the public hearing. And again, I don't believe I have any cards on this item, so we will close the public hearing and go back to council with a motion or comments. Vice Mayor?
I will make a motion that we adopt a resolution, which is in attachment 3 of our staff report, approving a modification of existing conditional use permit to allow wine and beer tasting with the conditions that are in our staff report, noting that the Planning Commission did recommend unanimously approval of this and that there were no opposition speakers at the Planning Commission.
Second.
We have a motion from Vice Mayor, second from Councilmember Spector. Any discussion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 17. Discuss the municipal finance requirements and specific town financial information.
Thank you, Mayor. This is your town manager, and I'm going to give the opening comments, but I do want you to know you've got a full complement of your town staff here to assist you with this particular item, including our expert consultant, Mr. Statler. On September 18th, the council requested staff to return with a more in-depth discussion of local finance principles and requirements, such as limitations that are placed on municipal investments, cash balances, and reserve levels and policies. This information was presented to you in a written staff report for this item. It's in a Q&A format to try and make it easy to discern the information. In September, the council also asked about best practice methodologies to determine a jurisdiction's budget reserve, such as the report that was prepared by the Government Finance Officers Association for the City of Colorado Springs. For this purpose, the town manager's office hired a government finance expert, Mr. William Statler, who has over 30 years of senior financial management experience with local government. His analysis and conclusions are contained in attachment 1 to your report. He joins our staff team in the town manager's office and finance department this evening to answer your questions and to go deeper with these particular issues. We're not going to do a line-by-line review of the staff report. However, we're available to answer any questions that you have and certainly are available to elaborate as you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pavetti. Do we have questions from council? Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Ms. Pavetti and Mr. Conway and whoever else put this together for us. I really appreciate it. It's quite informative.
You're welcome.
I had a question on page 6 of 18, but we don't really need to go to the page. The issue is, that I'm curious about, is with the internal service fund reserves, that it notes that the town does not have any formalized policy. And I'm just wondering why we don't, if there was any thought given to that, or has just never one been put in place and we haven't felt the need for it?
So as the report indicated, many cities throughout California do not have formal policies. However, if as a result of this discussion, the town council would like us to return with an internal service policy, we would be happy to do so. With a policy, we would be able to document our targets, and then we would be budgeting accordingly. So that is certainly one potential outcome from this evening's discussion.
Just a follow-up. Does the town staff, or Mr. Conway, do you have, is there an advantage or disadvantage that you see either way to the town council adopting a policy?
Yes, as the town manager stated, it's really not a common practice to have a reserve policy for internal service funds, but it is becoming more, I would say, in vogue as cities and towns across the country formalize some of these accounting issues. So we don't have a problem creating a policy for our internal service funds. We would probably be following a guideline roughly as the targets we've set, and we would just document that in a policy type format. So it would not be a problem for us to do that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Sayak.
Mr. Conway, so I appreciate the information in front of us. So I'm trying to understand the difference between the different funds and what happens if you don't have sufficient funds for those years' needs. So I'm looking at page 12, vehicle maintenance, and I believe it's 2014-15. So in that scenario, when you have higher expenses, can you just walk me through what happens? Where do you pull the revenue? And is this a scenario where if you had a target balance, it would have prevented exceeding it?
Thank you, Councilmember Sayak. This is a great question. So that is the reason why we've targeted a certain level of fund balance, so that if in a year when our revenues come into an internal service fund from our user departments. So in the case of the vehicle maintenance fund, that's for any department that uses one of our fleet vehicles. So they require maintenance and fuel and that sort of thing. So if we have some repairs not foreseen, not expected, we're going to have expenditures higher than the revenue we brought in. So we have a little bit of a fund balance there to carry us through. Hopefully the following fiscal year we'll have better experience. And actually I'm happy to say in the vehicle maintenance pool we've had some good experience the past couple of recent years. But yeah, that does provide a little fund there that we can go to if the piggy bank isn't empty, basically.
So, okay, so you've explained the intent of it. So using 2014-15 as the example, it looks like you spent more than what was in there. So where's the backfill come from?
Well, those bars reflect current revenues and current expense. So so if there's a bar of an expense higher than a revenue, it came out of the fund balance. Basically, the checking account balance that we had from the prior year is the best way I can explain that.
Okay.
So if you had, X amount of revenue in your bank account during the current year and you spent a little bit more than that, you better hope you had a savings account balance at the start of the year. You'd be in an overdraft.
Right.
Does that help?
It does,
Yes.
but I still don't see where the excess money came from then.
In years when we bring in charges, the departments, we have to estimate what our vehicle maintenance costs are. So we apportion those estimates of cost to the user departments, and they pay a fee based on like for our police department, based on the number of public safety vehicles that are in the fleet. They pay a user fee to that internal service fund. So if our expenses come below that in a good year, where we don't spend what we think we're going to spend, we'll have money in the savings account that will then provide us funding when we have years when the expenditures exceed what we brought in.
Okay, and so, but what happens in the inverse if you have more expenses? I guess I'm trying to figure out, in these situations where you have higher expenses,
Yes.
you have to pay, and so where does that difference come from?
From that fund balance in the years when we had revenues that were more than our expenses.
So
So-
it's not is it cumulative?
It's cumulative.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Okay. So
It's
then,
cumulative.
So what then I see in blue is just what we put into it.
The blue is the fund balance that's cumulative, that's being carried forward. So you can see it's dropping. If you look you see if you see those years in 16, 17 is a lower amount than 14, 15. You can see that the fund balance, that's the carrying amount of the checkbook, has dropped.
But your expenses have gone up.
They will go, yeah, and so if your expenses go up and your revenue wasn't high enough to cover them, your checking a book balance is going to go down.
And if there's not enough money in a particular fund, then we would come to council and ask for a budget adjustment to put money into the fund so that we can continue with town business.
And that would come from where?
The general fund typically.
General fund. Okay.
Yes.
So it's not that you're not paying the bill.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, we have adequate fund balance in there. You can see there still is fund balance, and we estimate that we will have fund balance at the end of this fiscal year in that fund.
Okay.
And that's
then
one of the questions is
then-
what are the appropriate levels of fund balance we should be keeping?
Okay, so I just want to make sure then, so this is what you would allocate almost in an account, yet if needed, we could pull from the general fund if our expenditures for that year is higher.
If we utilized all of that remaining fund balance, we would have to,
Got it.
yes.
Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on Councilmember Sack's questions because I think it's not completely clear. At least I have a different understanding of what I heard. Basically, each year you think there's going to be X amount of expenses, and you plan to have each of your departments pay into that fund to cover that for that year. If everything goes as planned, it's fine. If there's extra money, it ends up increasing this blue bar. So in other words, what you're not showing is how much money you had planned. You have a bar that shows what your expenses are, but you don't have a bar saying what you actually planned during that year for your expenses, for example. And the difference is the changing of the blue bar. So in effect, how much of a blue bar do you really need? It's kind of a working capital, so maybe part of my question would be, do you put all the money in at the beginning of the year from the different departments, or do they put it in during the year so that you actually need some kind of working capital because you might have an expense before you've collected from the departments?
Thank you, Councilmember Rennie. Great question. Some of our funds, I'm thinking of the workers' comp, are paid every 2 weeks based off the payroll. Some of them are done on a 1/12 monthly journal entry, basically. So each one is a little bit unique. But you're right, the blue bar is the result of any year's revenue, either over or under expense. And if there's a revenue above expense, you're going to have an increase to the blue bar. If there's a expenditure above the revenue, you'll have a decrease to the blue bar. Those numbers are in the budget. So if we looked at the internal service fund revenues, you'd see that in the case of many of our funds, like the workers' comp and the facilities maintenance and those, the charges we make to the departments are roughly equal to the expenditures that we anticipate that we're going to have for the year. There are a couple of funds where we build a fund balance for what I would say more of a contingent liability, and that is our general liability one. That's for claims that can occur where we have a target of $2 million, for instance, on our general liability. That's our target blue line that we try to hold because we may have a claim that's of substantial nature that the town will have to have funds available to address that liability. If it was a lawsuit and we needed to have money available to answer that claim, we would have sufficient fund balance without having to go to the general fund and possibly disrupt our services during the year or take from another reserve. So that was the intention of that type of fund. So each one is a little unique.
If I could follow up a little. So that explained, you have a couple funds that I would call more risk funds like
Yes.
that one, but you have some funds like the vehicle maintenance and IT is sort of the same, but maybe there's a little risk there too, because if something breaks, you may have a big expense. If I look at the vehicle maintenance for the 17-18 actuals, your fund balance is about half of your expenses. So that's saying, maybe that's the right number, I don't know, but that's saying, well, I need about half of what I'm going to spend during the year in working capital. Or maybe it could drop below that, or maybe that's running a little bit tight. I don't know. That's, I think, part of the question also.
Yeah, we have targets for each, we meaning the finance department in the budget office. Our goal when we create the budget every year is to make sure that these internal service funds are self-funded, that they can take care of business, and that there's an adequate blue bar available to address unforeseen needs. That's really our intention. We're not trying to build a large balance in there. We're trying to build a reasonable balance in each of those funds to cover business needs. Facilities maintenance is a good one to look at. We have a target of around $1 million. I've been director here about 18 years. Each time that I think I've mentioned, but why someone might ask, well, what, the target of 1 million, where does that come from? Well, each major HVAC repair that I've been aware of when I've been as director here has been in the range of $400,000 to $500,000 of total cost. So, and they seem to happen on a fairly frequent nature. So when these do happen and we have a boiler, a complete meltdown of our heating and ventilation system, we have funding available that we don't have to disrupt our general fund services. We have money in this facilities fund to cover that. That's a blue bar. Our target is, right now it's lower than that, but we'd like to build that back up to $1 million. Just because that would cover us for 2 or 1 really major facilities failure that we may have. We have numerous smaller projects that we have that are just unforeseen that occur with all of our city facilities. We have the public safety building on the boulevard. We have this civic center. We have the courtyard, all these areas. We have winter storm damage. We have our neighborhood center across the street. It's amazing to me. And we have used this fund numerous times and brought forward mid-year budget adjustments saying we had a roof failure across the street, and this is where we go when we need funding, and we don't have to disrupt our general fund services. So that's sort of a rationale for that one.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? Oh, Vice Mayor.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to Councilwoman Sack's question and make sure I'm understanding you correctly, and looking at page 14, which has a question: if the council directed the elimination of one or more internal service funds, how would the town handle expenditures for that item, e.g. equipment replacement? And the answer is, if there's not a specific fund, then the council would be asked to approve a budget adjustment, and any unanticipated budget adjustment would be required to identify a funding source, and we may have to take that money from something we've previously approved. So I understand that. I want to know if that's the same answer under Councilwoman Sayock's scenario, where you had a fund, but you just, I don't know, all your cars crashed at once, and now you didn't have enough money.
Yes, the answer would be,
the same scenario?
yeah, if we had a target of, say, $500,000 in our vehicle maintenance, and we had a meteor strike in our courtyard and wiped out our entire fleet of vehicles, then we would be, the blue bar would disappear. There'd be no more funding there, and then we'd have to go to the general fund and look for or from another internal service fund. But we'd have to go to another fund and look for replacement funds for those costs, because that's not available anymore. So you're correct,
Okay,
Councilman.
follow up? Okay, given your answer, back to my other question about developing a policy for internal service funds. If we had a policy that said your internal service fund for vehicle maintenance can never drop below 500,000 or whatever, you could not go to another internal service fund and cover the expense for the cars all being wiped out by a meteor if we had that in place.
Well, I would point to, that's correct, Councilmember Jensen, but I would point to one thing. It's typical in our reserve policies that we would say, if you had to go below our target for a particularly bad year, there's usually a provision you can write in the policy that says, but we'll give a 5-year payback. You know, if you had to temporarily borrow it from the general fund or from one of the other internal service funds, we could write a policy that would allow us to pay the fund that went below its target level over a period of time. We'd probably, that's pretty typical. You'll see that in a lot of reserve policies.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? Councilmember Sayak?
So I just want to follow up on that then. So that borrowing from different funds, that's only funds within the internal service.
No, we could borrow from the general fund also.
So then if that's the case, what's the point of having the policy? If, like, how does one define when you could dip into other reserves versus asking council?
So the policy would essentially help us with budgeting. So if the council said we'd like to have an internal service fund policy, these are the targets that we would work towards, then that would essentially set the overhead rate that we would then charge the departments, and we would then build the budget based on that. Any adjustment during the year would still require council action, but it essentially creates certainty in terms of what those targets are. And it would be could be a conversation for tonight or another time about which funds need a target. So for example, vehicle maintenance, in our analysis, no target is really needed because we typically have the cash flow on hand to meet the expenditures, and then we typically have a little bit of excess balance at the end of the year that essentially builds the bank for the following year. But other funds, such as our liability funds, we would definitely want to have a target so that way we could work towards meeting our expected needs and be able to manage risk throughout the year. And then again, if for whatever reason we have something that is unforeseen, then we would need to come back to the council and say, you know, we now have this unforeseen expenditure we need. It would be our recommendation to take from the general fund or another fund. But again, those would all be approved by you to make sure that we are making the best decisions possible for the town.
Any more questions from council? Right, we will move on to the public hearing portion. First speaker is Terry Derrier.
Hello. I thank the town council for the opportunity to express my thoughts to them. I speak as a resident. I also speak as a member of the Finance Committee. I'm speaking on this item 17 that says the Finance Committee discussed the internal service funds. That's actually a little misleading. We didn't have time to go into any depth with the internal service funds. Our focus was more on the general funds. We did mention them, so to that extent it's correct. I would comment on the Q&A about the financial committee comments in the staff report, and I do think that they represented what was said, which is practice. The town's current practice leads to excess cash being budgeted instead of being put forward towards more productive use. So that was really the conclusion that came out of the very limited discussion. On a second point, in the Q&A, I was flabbergasted. I tried to come up with a different word, but I stick with flabbergasted by the staff's response to the question, why does the town budget non-safety positions at top tier? Here's my interpretation of the answer. Town staff prepares a budget that provides only a loose budgetary control over salaries. Budgets are a control mechanism, a management tool. In effect, what the policy says is there's no budget impediment to increasing an employee's pay to a top scale if the employee threatens to leave. That just doesn't sound like good management to me. The question I'd ask the town council, or at least suggest the town council ask, is what percentage of employees who have been here at least 3 years are at top scale? And if that's a high percentage, that may explain why. Since I have another minute, I'll just comment on the discussions we had on the internal service funds that I was able to summarize at the end of the town council, the finance committee meeting. And it's, if the staff insists on establishing so many reserves, as they have with all these sub-funds and the internal service funds, as well as other funds, they also need to look at the reserves in the aggregate, not just as individual reserves, and recognize there's not 100% correlation for them all to be due at the same time. In other words, if a meteor does strike, if we feel it's necessary to have funds put aside, it's not going to wipe out all of them. The second comment is to look at the opportunity cost of money sitting in each one of these funds. It might be better deployed to a higher return investment. The last comment, and I don't know how much time I get, but it's a 10-second comment. We just raised the sales tax on the argument that we needed additional funds. This isn't the time to be putting more money in the bank.
Thank you, Mr. Derrier. Do we have any questions for him? Mr. Rennie.
Thank you. If I could go to your comment about salary budget control. So if I think through sort of a typical business world, there's sort of a balance between how much you delegate to your managers and how much do you control, right? If I'm a CEO of a company, I probably give this division a budget, and I know, okay, this is going to be salaries. I'll say, okay, here's your budget increase. You figure out how you want to spread it around. Same thing as it goes down to departments and so forth. So obviously we've done that, and I think your comment is saying, well, we've given them too big of a budget to play with. How do we figure out what the right amount of delegation versus budget flexibility is?
Well, I think it's based on the specifics. You might assume some level of turnover. Look at the people that you have in your positions and budget what you think it's going to cost to fill that position. To add what your comment was, when I was a manager, I let my managers know, you figure out how you want to spend the money. You can have some high-priced talent that are better than average, but that means you have to have some other talent that's not going to be at the top of the scale. You can't afford to pay everybody at the top of the scale.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Seeing none, thank you. Next speaker is Philip Queen.
How do I do that?
This is really important, so I want everyone to be able to see this. Can you all see that? Everyone can see? Yes? Perfect. Okay. Phil Keowan, thank you for allowing me to speak. I apologize. I have inundated your inboxes with a bunch of materials, and I'm standing here today to try to just summarize very quickly. I'm going to speak about just the Internal Services Fund. As in everything, God is in the details, right? So here is a 9-year cash flow out of the CAFR that shows for all the Internal Services Funds, the first line that I've yellowed, how much did you put into it? Now remember, this is a 100% reimbursement fund. So if you have an expense, the general fund is reimbursing you 100%. Expenses should equal revenue. Everyone understand that? So over 9 years, we put $43 million in. The next yellow line, we've took out $40 million in paid out expenses. Salaries, suppliers, claims. That means over this 9-year period, you pumped in $3 million more that everyone on this council was not aware of. You don't see this. $3 million went more into this cookie jar. So what happened? How come the fund balance coming down? Well, because you've taken it back out. You took out $1.7 million in a transfer back to the general fund. You took out $2 million in 2016. Does that ring a bell? That was for the Almond Grove. So this thing, in actuality, is a cookie jar of stashing cash. Regardless of what staff has said, this is what actually has happened. So over a 9-year period, $3.3 million went in more than you actually used, and then you drew out, based upon other needs, based upon things that this council decided, a total net, because there were some transfers in and out, but roughly $4 million. That's how this thing has worked. My recommendation is you have $3 million excess cash sitting in this fund. You should pull it out, as Terry said. You have better uses for it than just sitting there. And the reason why I say you have $3 million is because many of you may not realize this, but up until this year, you budgeted salaries into this internal services fund. There are no salaries, as you can see. That number is blank going forward. You took out all the people. So the only charges in there now are for suppliers and claims. So you have this $10 million of cash. You have less expenses. By the way, it gets 100% reimbursed. What do we need $10 million of cash in this internal services fund? That's the question. Thank you.
We have a question for you from Councilmember Spector.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You're saying pull it out, the excess. Pull it out when in a budgetary cycle?
You can do it any time you wish. This is a total administrative action that the town council can pass a resolution that says, just like you did for Almond Grove, take $2 million out of the internal services fund, which, by the way, I think it was out of vehicle. I think it was vehicle repair, I think, where you took it, and you put it into a reserve called Almond Grove in the general fund.
All right, let me stop you there because I need to understand this better. The fund is established. A fund is established with X amount of money. At some point, it has more money than X. And so how is the council going to keep tabs on it and know when to take it out, as you're saying?
So I think the recommendation the question that was asked, should you have a policy? Absolutely. You should have guidelines around this. When the balance exceeds those guidelines, it should be a red flag. You have excess cash, let's redeploy it to some other need. We can debate what those guidelines are. I don't agree with the guidelines that you've been told.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Cohen. Okay, so concludes the speaker cards I have, unless anyone else wants to speak on item number 17. I see somebody raising their hand in the back. This is item number 17. If you want to speak on this item, please come forward.
My apologies. I wrote the wrong agenda item. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think part of the discussion we just heard from the previous two speakers had to do with opportunity cost and what the town is missing in terms of that opportunity cost. If we're not earning back or spending the money where there's a higher cost associated with it, or we're not earning the best interest, that's an opportunity that we're missing. And we're talking millions of dollars over a fiscal year. So to be consistent with the comments of the earlier two speakers, I encourage the council to do the right thing and to make sure that they understand and are comfortable with the impact of the disclosures that are in the management discussion and analysis in the CAFR. And that's pages 18 to 29, which has some edits in the final version that you have. Please do that before accepting and approving the CAFR.
Mr. Fagot, we're on item number 17. The CAFR is item number 6. So we're going to get to item number 6 after the next item, which is item number 5. So if you want to speak on the CAFR, I have a card for you on the CAFR. But we're speaking on...
I'll come back and
okay.
do that.
Okay. Sorry for the misunderstanding.
No, my apologies.
That's okay. Does anybody else wish to speak on item number 17? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. We'll move back to council for discussion. Councilmember Sayak.
So if, not discussion, but more questions of staff, if it's okay. So, Mr. Conway, I'm trying to better understand, I like the idea of setting policy, and so just walk me through, is 10 million the target policy that you're intending for the total internal service funds, and then you divvy it up based on the different sub-funds, or is it the opposite? You looked at each individual one, determined what was appropriate, and then we just happened to get to a round number?
Yeah, we look at each individual one, we set the goal for each individual one, and then whatever it totals up to in this case, currently our target is around $10 million.
Okay. And then if you could just explain to me again, some of the funds you decided should have a target, some did not. I understand some had risk associated. Could you walk me through again which one, why you determined which ones have a target, why some don't?
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Sayak. I can address that real quickly. The vehicle, I'll use an example of one that we didn't really have a target for, and that's more of, as Mr. Kean had commented about, some of the internal service funds are money in, money goes right back out. Vehicle maintenance is a great example. Typically, that fund just does ordinary gas and oil filter transmission repairs. It's pretty. We're not anticipating in vehicle maintenance, which is different from vehicle replacement, which is our equipment replacement. Vehicle replacement is a large dollar amount, but vehicle maintenance would be like what you would budget for maintaining your car, not replacing your car. So in that particular fund, we didn't need to set a real target because we were pretty much breaking even. In other words, our annual maintenance costs pretty much equaled what we were charging the departments. We've had a buildup of the blue bar because our maintenance costs have we've just had great luck. We haven't had transmission failures and that sort of thing. That can reverse. So that's an example of a fund without a target. The facilities maintenance fund has a target of $1 million because that particular fund has some very large ticket, unforeseen possibilities that we would, so if we, and here's the danger when we go below, and I understand the comments from the public about wanting to use some of the money and put it to work for other purposes. It's valid. I don't disagree with it one iota, but that has consequences because if you drop your cash balances across these funds, that means when the bad thing happens, you don't have a place to go anymore. You have to go to the general fund, which may already have a balanced budget and reserves set aside for all the things and all the projects that we have decided are the priorities, we meaning council, not staff. You're going to have to go somewhere else to meet if we had an HVAC failure and you had set a reserve policy of only $250,000 in the facilities fund. You no longer have that money. You have to come up. We have a $500,000 HVAC failure. Now you've got $250,000 you can pull from the facilities fund, but then we will need to recommend to council where we're going to get the other $250,000. So all of these, these funds and these amounts didn't just, it wasn't an accident, I'll put it that way. So, but not saying that we can't look at this a little closer, and maybe we can, with a policy, look at these and see. And I welcome that. It's always good to examine your targets and see if they're reasonable.
Okay, we have a follow-up from Councilmember Sayak, and then we'll move on to Councilmember Spector.
And then this is my last one, and it's a larger. So the policy then, whenever we have a cash flow excess, we have this trickle down that we talked about in May, where we then replenish in these funds any fund that does not meet that target.
We would have a policy that would say if you were below your target levels, let's say for instance the facilities fund had a target of $1 million and now it was at $600,000, I would be thinking that our policy would say how are we going to in an orderly fashion restore that back to $1 million? Yes.
What happens if the opposite? What happens if these funds start accumulating too much? How do we get it back? It goes back into the general fund?
Yes, what we could do in that case, just I'm thinking off the top of my head, but if let's say we had $1 million target in the facilities fund and now we have $1.5 million, we could have a process where that $500,000 excess could be rebated in the form of lower facilities maintenance charges that we charge off to the departments. So that would drop our general fund budget, and there would be less money coming into the facilities fund. And then it would drop, the blue bar would drop, and the expenses would go down for a temporary period in the general fund. So it'd be like offering a rebate back to our customers, because we theoretically would have overcharged them. That's why the blue bar went above our target.
Got it.
Yes.
Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To put some of this in context, the Finance Committee had the fund balances on our agenda item as an agenda item at our last meeting. However, it was agenda item 4, and there was a concept that our meeting would go from 4 to 5:30, and by the time the committee members got to discussing these funds, it was like 7 o'clock, and there was basically, I think it was Mr. Duryea. I was writing as he was talking. He was saying there's too many buckets, we need a single bucket, not in favor of increasing focus on blah, blah, blah. Anyway, his blah, blah, blah was a lot of what he was saying. Sorry, Mr. Duryea. I wasn't writing as fast as you were talking. The bottom line is that we got to the end of the staff and expert presentation. It was 7 o'clock. Mr. Duryea said these things, and every member of the committee said, we agree, and that's how the meeting ended. What we didn't do is we didn't actually go into looking at the economic and catastrophic funds. We didn't get into examining all of these other funds. I think that what staff does is examine what these funds are and how much might be reasonable is a good thing. But I actually also think that the Finance Committee and then ultimately the Council should be looking at that exact issue and making a decision on what the policy should be, and then going forward with our budgeting.
Vice Mayor?
Just sort of a follow-up on some questions. So the internal service funds are separate and distinct from our reserve funds, i.e. the budget stabilization fund and the catastrophic reserve. Those reserve funds, we have a policy in place for those. So to the extent that we're discussing doing any kind of policy, we're talking about the internal service funds, which are different, and we don't have a policy for. Okay. So you're nodding, so I'm right about that. Oh. If the council were to determine that a policy was appropriate for the internal service funds, I'm assuming it could be written in a manner similar to the reserve, which directs where monies might go. So instead of being a rebate, for example, we could say, okay, if it gets to be 500,000 over, then ding, 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 come back to council and determine what you're going to do with it, which may be spend it on something totally different than rebating. It could be written like that as well, correct?
I think the reserve policy would be totally under our control as a town organization to craft that, yes.
Then my second question is a procedural one with respect to this item. We are not being asked to take any action at all, and it's noticed as a discuss. So what power, if any, does the council have, given the format of the public notice, to take any action versus discuss and ask questions?
Thank you. We deliberately set this up as a discussion because this is exactly what a council needs to do, is understand the funds, ask your questions of staff as well as our consultants, and then determine appropriate next steps. So should there be some interest in pursuing a policy, it would be very appropriate to make a motion that we return with a draft internal service fund policy for your consideration. When we bring it back, we would identify the targets, the what happens if we have excess balance, et cetera. So we would do our best attempt in terms of those funds. And then for those funds that don't need a balance, based on the prior finance committee input and some other input, we may have other options for those funds that may not be targets, and maybe they no longer need to be internal service funds, but we can budget those items differently. So we would come back with some options for your consideration and further discussion prior to adoption.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rennie?
Thank you. I realize we're sort of moving towards solution ideas, but I have more of a nuts and bolts question, and I'd like to put you in the uncomfortable position of explaining somebody else's table. When I compare Mr. Keown's table where he shows that we gained $3.3 million in cash from the internal service funds, I'm having trouble connecting his table to what I see in our report. And for example, his says beginning cash, ending cash for 2018 is plus or minus 10 million. When I look at our staff report on page 6, the total internal service funds for 2018 are looks like just over 6 million. So I don't feel like I'm talking apples and apples here. And I realize it's not your table, but any light you could shed would be helpful.
Thank you, Councilmember Rennie. I don't know, I'm obviously was not helping Mr. Keown develop his table, so I think I would refrain from trying to reconcile that at the dais right now. I would want to see more detail on how he arrived at his numbers. These numbers on our tables are from our CAFR and these are fund balance numbers. He may use, and could elaborate, but he may have used the cash, which is cash balance is different than fund balance. And I don't want to get into a long accounting explanation of that, but there is a difference.
So well, let me ask a little more. So cash balance means more than just the internal service funds. It might include the GFAR or other things like that?
Let me give you a simple answer. In other words, you could have a $10 million cash balance in a fund, but you may have a $4 million liability in that fund. In other words, you had a claim or you had a large expense that you owe someone. You owe $4 million of that $10 million of cash to this party, and we as professional accountants have to accrue a liability for that in the fund. So now our $10 million cash balance has turned into a $6 million blue bar fund balance, if that's helpful.
It is helpful. So what I'm really trying to understand is, so his $3 million accumulation, that may not actually be $3 million of cash, or well, I guess it is cash, but it may not be $3 million of equity because at the same time we may have higher liabilities sitting there right now.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I'd have to look at his calculations and go to the CAFR, and we could do that, and that's I'm not making a comment one way or another about the veracity of his numbers. I would like to just address this $3 million. So one of the funds that we do accumulate a significant cash balance where it would look as if our revenues have exceeded our annual expenditures is our equipment replacement fund. That's the fund council pulled some money out for the almond grove. So that fund is a great example of a fund where we are accumulating cash. When Mr. Keown talks about a cash accumulation, or he uses the term cookie jar, the cookie jar, in fact, is a valid business purpose. We have a money building up in there, and what we do as finance staff is we have a complete list of all of our fleet and all of our town equipment, and we know from our managers when we think we'll be replacing this equipment. So we have to charge a department an amount that in 8 years from now, if they have a front-end Caterpillar loader out in the courtyard and we are going to be replacing a $200,000 front-end loader 10 years or 9 years from now, we charge an amount annually that the Public Works Department pays into the equipment replacement fund, and that cash builds up year by year. So if someone looked at that, they'd say, well, it looks like you're building up cash. Well, yes, in fact, we are, because in 9 years, we want to buy a replacement front-end loader so that if we have a flood or damage, we've got the money right there to make that purchase. So those are some of the nuances of the internal service fund that don't get fully, when you just, that need to really be thought about. There's a real business purpose for a lot of this. But I'm at the same time saying that we can look at our targets and also see if there's ways where we can free up some excess cash that might be in certain of these funds. I think that's a reasonable goal. But to just throw a number out without a lot of study is just not going to get us. That's also not doing us a great service. And we have a strong rationale for these amounts. And if we lower them, we want to have a strong rationale for that also.
And if I could just respond a little bit, I realize it's difficult to justify it where somebody else got numbers from, and that's sort of what you're intimating with the equipment replacement. But even if I look at the equipment replacement graph, Mr. Killens goes from 2010 through 2018. He says we've gained $3.3 million. The equipment replacement fund, if I look at the dollars back in 09-10, it was at $3 million, and it's currently at just over $2 million. So it's actually lower than 10 years ago. It's not higher. And your summary internal funds do the same thing. They show lower, much lower than they were many years back. So I'm still confused where his 3.3 is coming from, and I understand that it's
yes,
not
we
your
would have
3.3.
to we'd have to compare numbers, and
Okay.
I don't think that'd be productive this evening.
If I could ask a completely different direction question?
Yes.
So part of this was also talking about what is the right level of funds, and we have a report from a consultant in here that spent a lot of time comparing the GFOA, their recommendations of what certain fund levels should be, and they kind of came out with Los Gatos should be about where we are for our general fund reserves, which are only the emergency fund and the economic stability fund at 25%. And then I asked this in finance committee, and I never really got a complete answer. That doesn't say what our other fund balances should be, all these other internal service funds, right? It really just said, yes, maybe our two emergency funds of two different types, emergencies, is at the right level, but it's not really telling me is the rest of it at the right level. And the answer I got kind of at the time was, well, the GFOA expects you to have these other funds, so they're sort of expecting, that maybe these funds are at the right level, but there was no real good input on that.
That is correct. Mr. Statler's analysis, and he can speak to that if you'd like, council would like him to. He's here this evening. But his analysis was focusing just on the general fund. I think he did make a reference, though, and I had also done my homework on that. Our internal service fund balances, I've looked at a number of cities, are probably slightly under the balances kept by comparable cities here on the peninsula for internal service funds. So we're right in line, or probably a little bit below where other cities our size with our same risk and our same services have kept and established their internal service funds. I have a chart that I could share with council, but I didn't want to get into that granular level of detail. But Mr. Statler, I think, made the same observation as I did.
Yeah, I'm going to try and be as terse as possible. The focus of my work is on what I would call the operating reserve, really focus on those budget stabilization and catastrophic response issues. And as I apply the GFOA risk methodology, it's really intended to focus on that component of your working capital, your fund balance, your reserves, if you will. You have within the general fund itself other categories you set money aside for, compensated absences, capital projects, but you're not unique in that. Almost virtually every other city that I benchmarked you against also has funds set aside for internal services and for capital projects and for compensated absences and for pension obligations. So the best apples to apples comparison is to focus on that purpose of your reserves that are for catastrophic response or for budget stabilization. And for that, you can use the benchmarking to identify what's happening. In that case, the average of the 12 cities I looked at was 25% as a policy. On the other hand, their actual was about 47%. So their actual reserves for those purposes, budget stabilization and catastrophic responses, about double what their policy was. I think you were also accurate in that the work I did in the assessment using the GFOA methodology and the benchmarking was really focused on that 25% or 12.5% for budget stabilization, 12.5% for catastrophic response. Those other items, I didn't evaluate to see if there's a specific target. I don't know that you actually have developed specific targets for those. But again, the work on your budget stabilization and catastrophic was focused on those items. And that's what the GFOA risk methodology is most attuned to looking at. And that's what the benchmark analysis looked at as well.
Any other questions from council? Councilmember Spector?
Following up on what you were just saying, and maybe I'm on the wrong issue, or maybe I'm not. One of the things that caught my attention in your presentation to the Finance Committee was your graph on general fund operating reserves, policy versus actual. And in that one you had, I don't know how many cities are here, let's say 10 cities, and they show varying, their graphs vary, red line versus blue line, except when you get to us, our red line and our blue line is the same, and which was surprising, except you explained, and please confirm this, that ours is the same because we put the excess money into GFAR. And so that's why we don't have a buildup there. Is that correct?
That is correct. You have, and I think actually in many ways you've paid more attention to this in your policies than other cities have. But yes, your policy is if your targeted reserve at 25% in total is actually greater than that, then you transfer, after looking at other reserves that might be appropriate, you transfer that balance to your capital projects. So that puts you in a unique position where your target and your actual for that 25% reserve are always going to be equal. I would point out, however, in support of that approach, your general fund is really the only significant funding source you have for capital projects. Other cities have other resources that they can draw upon potentially to do that. So to the degree that you have unmet capital needs, and to the degree that you set funds aside for that in your general fund and you kind of assign them for capital improvements, that positions you better to deal with funding your capital improvements. And in fact, as I understand it, for example, your library expansion a few years ago, because you set money aside for capital improvements, you were able to basically do on a cash basis, pay-as-you-go basis. Very few cities are in a position to be able to set money aside for those kind of positions, and that's the kind of project most cities would have debt financed, rather than being able to be in a position to pay as you go. So from my perspective, the fact that you've set money aside for capital projects is actually a pretty progressive approach to making sure you have the resources available to do important capital projects.
And I know I read this before, or maybe I heard you say it before. When you talk about the GFAR being used for the library, are you saying in addition to the RDA funds, or because that was a big part of it?
The GFAR balance, I can help Mr. Sadler. We did have some RDA financing for the library, but about $4 million of town money from GFAR was used for the preliminary, all the preliminary engineering and all the preliminary costs before we could bring the project to bond. So $4 million of town money was available from GFAR
So then we got into the RDA, which was what, about 30 million?
No, I believe it was around, I don't want to misstate. I'm thinking 18 million, but total 22.
If I could just make one other point, when you look at the purposes other than the operating reserve for how you have set funding aside, they are all for one-time purposes, which is appropriate. Because the reality is whatever reserves you have, whether they're in the internal services funds, whether they're part of that 25% budget stabilization catastrophic reserve, whether it's for capital projects, you can only spend that once. you can't really fund operating costs with that, at least not in the long term. And to the degree that you do have reserves, you've designated them for one-time purposes, and that's going to keep you out of trouble in the future.
Okay, any more questions from council? Seeing no more, we have the vice mayor.
I was just going to try, I don't know if a motion in this context procedurally is correct or not, but Ms. Pavetti was talking about next steps. So based upon the discussion, I would make a motion that staff come back to us with proposals for how a policy that addresses our internal service funds would look, including the basis for the current targets, how that is supported, I don't know, a snapshot in kind of how our expenses, how they work, understanding it's cumulative, but maybe it's more helpful for people like me to see in a year what happened, where did we get money, where did it not, why are you doing it the way you're doing it. I would be interested in a look at whether it makes sense if we were to do a policy to have a range target, which I read about, which is, you know, have a low end, a high end, and if it gets too low, have something that says, okay, we'll do something. If it gets too high, come back to council and say, now what do you want to do with this excess? But to have that explored and the basis for that and how it would work. So just kind of a comprehensive look with a draft about how an internal service fund policy might work.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? I'll make a second to the motion. So we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Mr. Rennie.
So I was considering second with asking for additional to the motion, because I think the question that has been brought up at the Finance Committee and is really the question overall is the problem. Let's start with the problem. The problem is when we have all these funds and we start looking at, well, what's a good range for each fund? You start, you know, what they've been called cookie jars. We start putting a lot in a bunch of different cookie jars, and we say, well, we only draw from this cookie jar for one thing, and we only draw from this one from another thing, and so forth. And the problem is it all adds up to more padding than you really need, because you got to pad each of the uses. So the question I think that's sort of bubbling in the Finance Committee is there some way to reduce the number of funds, not figure out what the optimal is for each one? Maybe that's useful, but I think it takes us in the wrong direction. But is there a way to think differently and reduce the number of cookie jars so that we don't need to pad, 10 for each one? We could do maybe 15 for two instead of 10 for, combined two. I hopefully this is understandable. So I would have liked to seen something in the motion that explored reducing the number of funds so we don't need so many paddings adding up.
Through the mayor as the maker of the motion. I am not a computer programmer, so I often leave things out. I'm assuming that my motion would contain an exploration of how these funds work and whether they're at, when I was talking about targets, whether they are at appropriate levels. I don't want my motion to call them cookie jars. I want to call them internal service funds, and I want to have a basis for them. And if there's no basis, then we should know that. So that's what I am intending to look at, which would presumably include whether or not the amount should be reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the direction of the motion is good. I believe that the internal service funds should be analyzed or reevaluated. The concept of combining should be reevaluated or evaluated. I also think, however, that the economic and catastrophic funds should be examined, and that either after the staff has done its analysis or before it does its analysis, and then before the issue comes back to the council, that it comes through the Finance Committee, not because I'm on the Finance Committee, but because the expertise and ability to analyze these issues is very significant, and I think it would be a great benefit to this council to have that expertise fed into it before it makes its decision.
Vice Mayor.
Okay, so as the maker of the motion, I do not wish to include that because I'm limiting it to internal service funds as to which we do not have a policy. We have a policy with respect to catastrophic and budget stabilization. So I'm just looking for the discussion today about those funds as to which we do not have a policy. And given that this is discussion, I think a change to the reserve funds that Councilwoman Spector is talking about is not something that at least I, as the maker of the motion, want to put forward in this context. I think it's maybe more appropriate in a different discussion or with CAFR, not with this particular item. That's why I do not wish to include it.
Councilmember Sayak.
A question and then a comment. Procedurally, I want to make sure that I understand that we are sending this back to staff to develop a policy with the rationale, and the policy would contain different alternatives to be looked at. I believe it will go, and I'm just going to see if I understand the motion, it will go through the Finance Committee for its exploration also, and then it comes back. Is that correct?
That wasn't part of my motion.
That was not. Okay. May I ask if that could be amended to include it as a part of the motion?
As the maker of the motion, I do not want to include that amendment because what I'm looking for is very preliminary. So I would like to just see whether the council even wants to pursue a policy. If the council determines it wants to pursue a policy, then I'm assuming that there would be a further motion that would determine what happened with that draft policy.
Councilmember Rennie.
Circling back, so I'm willing to support the motion, but I agree with what we just heard that there probably needs to be a follow-on motion. I think it's fine to work for a policy on these internal service funds, but I remind us that when I look back at what is this agenda item, it does also include independent analysis of the catastrophic and budget stabilization reserve. So that is part of what we're supposed to be thinking about up here. And the question again becomes, do we have too many paddings in all of these, including the budget stabilization funds and the internal stabilization funds? Can we combine them? You know, the idea is you put, I'm going to keep calling it padding, you put padding in for risks that may occur. If it's an earthquake that does damage, if it's half the IT system going down and you need a big chunk of money, is, you know, the HVAC and the Civic Center blows up, whatever the risk is, by having a fund that covers each one separately, they're not all going to happen at the same time. So you end up with a lot of extra padding. So I think we would want a follow-on motion that looks at it in aggregate.
Okay, so why don't we call the vote on the first motion, and then we'll see what happens next. So I'm going to call the question.
Could we just make sure we understand? So the motion is strictly for a policy.
The motion was, and I'm going to get this wrong, maybe Ms. Pravetti can help me, but it was intended to be very preliminary in general.
Right. So the notes that I took as the maker of the motion spoke was that that staff would return to the town council with a draft internal service fund policy, identifying the justification and basis for our current targets, including information regarding actual expenditures and revenues, include options for target ranges such as minimum and maximums for each fund, and then procedures if the fund falls below the minimum, then what the council options would be. If it's too high, what would be the guidelines for further council action. The analysis should include an exploration of perhaps reducing the number of funds and then how all of these funds would work.
That's very good, thank you. But just to include that, in making the motion, my assumption was that those things were intended, the draft, for the council to determine whether it even wanted to have a policy.
Okay, so we'll call the question on the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No?
So it passes 4-1. Councilmember Spector dissenting? Okay. Councilmember Sayak voted yes. Okay, so looking to council, there was discussion about more motions. Does anybody want to put out another motion? Councilmember Sayak.
Now I'd like a procedural motion to follow on the policy motion. So after staff has created a draft, I would like for this to go to Finance Committee for review. And when Finance Committee reviews it, I'd like a discussion on not only what was presented, but are there other alternatives that the Finance Committee would like to add on, so that when the council sees the draft, there are various options available to review and to make a decision on. And the reason why, and the basis for this is, when I look at the internal service funds, I understand the target, but I look at it in the opposite way of Director Conway, of I'm looking at the total aggregate of 10 million and looking at the 10-year actuals and wondering if we could just have an internal service fund that can be fluid, so that it could be dropped down to perhaps 8 million, anticipating that there are expenditures from various funds that will be tapped into, but that we have a lower amount that Director Conway can then determine on a yearly basis how to move the funds in a fluid manner. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so that would be a motion, and Councilmember Spector has her hand up.
My hand up is getting ready to make a second, but I need clarification through the mayor as to whether or not, because there was some general wording in that motion, and it was not clear to me as to when it goes back to the Finance Committee, if the Finance Committee can look at the economic and catastrophic funds.
To the maker of the motion.
There is nothing in my motion that would preclude that. I want what is created to be looked at by Finance Committee. If they'd like to look at that in analysis with other funds, that's fine with me.
I'll second the motion.
So we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion on this one? Town Manager.
Thank you. I just wish to remind the council that you've adopted a resolution that identifies the purpose of the Finance Committee, and the Finance Committee is not a budget committee. You are discussing internal service funds. You're talking about concerns about excess cash. This is not the role of the Finance Committee to provide advice for you on that. They've made their point very clear that there is an opinion that the town has excess cash. They've also opined as to how the town might want to use that excess cash. But for them to be discussing internal service funds, there is nothing in this resolution that provides that purview. If the council wants, we could revisit the purpose of the Finance Committee at another date, and you can redetermine how you would wish your Finance Committee to work. But as it's currently stated, it is not. It can look at increasing revenue and give you advice on future tax measures or parcel taxes. It can look at the review of the CAFR, which it did, our investment policy, which it does. But there's no discussion in here that gives it the authority to advise you on your budget. That is the role of the town council. So with all due respect, I think if there's interest in public participation, staff is very open to that. But I think if we are going to open this up for public participation, we need a broader forum so that way other members of the community can opine on our budgeting practices. Thank you.
Thank you. So based on what the town manager just said, obviously there are two sitting council members on the Finance Committee, and there is the citizens portion of the Finance Committee. So I guess what you are mentioning is there's nothing in our current policy which supports the citizens portion of the Finance Committee to opine on budgetary items. However, the council, the sitting council members, may have the authority to do that. Is that correct?
you would have the authority to do it within the body of the 5 council members together collectively, which is why this item is before you tonight. It was really a courtesy that we brought it to the committee earlier this month. There had been a lot of interest over the entire calendar year, and since we knew we needed to come back with more detail on our internal service funds based on our discussion in September, we thought, well, why don't we give the Finance Committee the courtesy of seeing this information as well as the consultant's analysis. So if we made the error of creating an expectation, I apologize, but we thought it would be best to try and be a little bit more transparent, air out this information. But I think when I look back at this resolution, I think, maybe that's another future action for the council, is to consider what purpose you would like your Finance Committee to have.
So, based on what you just mentioned, we have a motion and a second that we technically can't vote forward. Is that what you're, or vote on, or?
You certainly can still vote on it. Although it's a policy of this council, so they have the ability not to follow their own policy. But if you do vote on it and send it to Finance Committee, I certainly believe you should be bringing in that resolution back to make changes to it. My observations is that, we formed this Finance Committee, we prepared a resolution. Maybe it is time that the council does review that resolution, because my observations is the Finance Committee is going far beyond what the initial scope in the resolution states, and you certainly can change that to include all of those things, or to put further language to clarify exactly what the purpose of the Finance Committee is. So yes, you can vote on it. You would be in violation of your own policy, and if you do that, then I certainly would schedule it promptly, because you don't want to be consistently in violation of your own policies.
Councilmember Sayoc.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand procedurally. So my intent tonight is to provide a venue for those that are interested in financial matters, whether they are sitting Finance Committee members or those in the public or those who may just wish to start participating, an avenue for them to weigh in and provide expertise. So I'm hearing that perhaps the Finance Committee is not the appropriate. I'm hearing that perhaps it is, that we bring a resolution forward to clarify what the Finance Committee is. What comes first, the Finance Committee resolution or the draft internal service fund? What do you think, how quickly does Director Conway think he can produce something? So that's the first question. And then second is, if we are looking at a larger venue to basically ask anyone in the public to weigh, who may be interested in finance, is there a more appropriate avenue to do so?
Well, we're very interested in I think we've seen this evening that we have members of the public who are not currently sitting on the Finance Committee who have great interest. And so I think we could easily create a forum for those persons, as well as members of the public who have also attended in the audience to the Finance Committee. So we're starting to grow a body of residents who are very interested, and we could certainly reach out to them, and then using our social media, we would welcome every other resident who is interested in financial matters. I think in terms of the sequence, and also just thinking of our workload that's currently in progress, doing the additional analysis as requested in the first motion in terms of that exploration to determine if council even wants a new internal service fund, we would have to figure out when we could do that, because we're about to do strategic priorities in January, as well as receive your budget direction so we can start working on the next 1920 budget. We have mid-year coming up in February, so we will need to, prepare that report and bring all of those items to you. So it's going to probably be a little while before we're going to be able to get to the internal service fund. Plus, this year we are also working on our fee study. So most likely in February, you will be holding a public hearing to determine whether or not any adjustments to fees are necessary. All of this does play into the budget. But in terms of sequence, I just see a lot of workload heading its way to our finance department. So I think in terms of sequence, probably the next best thing to do would be to bring forward the resolution on the finance committee so council can discuss its purpose and make additional clarifications. Please know that, I think just having this discussion about our internal service funds as well as our general fund reserve policy, I think staff is hearing loud and clear that, there might be some more room for further exploration, and we're happy to do outreach meetings with members of the public. We would certainly inform the council of when those would be, and we could do that even at the exploratory phase if that's the will of the council.
Councilmember Sayak.
Okay, given all the various options before us, I think what I would like to do through the mayor is to move forward with the policy, understanding that it may be in violation of an existing policy. And the reason that I will continue to keep the motion is I want to move this forward. I want it to be a priority, and I want the mayor and the manager to work on what the process is to ensure that we can continue this discussion with in a timely manner, in a legally, procedurally appropriate way.
Thank you. So a question from the mayor to the town manager. I guess what we would have to do is put on the agenda in the not too distant future the discussion about the expanded scope of the finance committee. And I would assume that would have to occur before the next finance committee meeting, because we wouldn't want to hold a meeting prior to expanding the scope if that's the direction that the council decides to choose.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
That's correct. And quite frankly, doing that little bit of work is much more digestible than getting started on the internal service fund policy. So that we can easily schedule with your concurrence early in the calendar year.
Okay, very well. Thank you. Vice Mayor.
Through the mayor, is the motion now on the table, the original motion to send a question about internal service funds back to the finance committee? I don't even know what the current motion is right now.
If I could ask the town manager to recap, if you may, the motion made by Councilmember Sayak that was seconded by Councilmember Spector.
I'll give it a try, but please make appropriate amendments. So it was a procedural motion to bring the material regarding the exploration of the ISF policy to the Finance Committee, as well as alternatives such as the item that Mr. Rennie raised for discussion, and that was intended to be a venue for interested persons of the public to participate.
Okay, but we don't know the timing of that. Pending the whatever change, if any, there is to the resolution that creates the expanded finance committee.
Well, I think the maker of the motion added that even if it violates the resolution for the finance committee, the motion still held.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'm glad you will be bringing back the resolution, Finance Committee resolution, for our review, because not only did our last meeting discuss all of these items and have it on the agenda, but, and I'm not telling you I remember it, but when I had the resolution for the Finance Committee read to me, in my mind, it was broader than some people might think.
Any more discussion on this motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
No.
Passes 4-1. Vice Mayor dissented. And are there any other comments or motions? Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. I'd like to make another motion to test the council's interest. Again, this motion was really just focused on the internal service funds, and Town Manager Pavetti said, and including something Mr. Rennie said, which wasn't very clear. What the question that I want to ask the council through a motion is, So the motion would be to ask staff to explore all the funds in aggregate, explore them from this risk standpoint, right? Each of these funds has a risk of some sort they're mitigating, whether it's need for equipment or something bad going wrong. Look at it in aggregate, so including the budget stabilization and disaster fund along with these. So that would be my motion, but I want to ask staff a question first to help the council understand whether they want to support this. So my question for staff would be, how much work is this? And so we have a report by an independent consultant. I don't know how much it cost us. I don't know how much work it was, just focused on 2 of them. Do we need an independent consultant to look at the whole thing that I'm talking about? Is there another way staff could look at it? How much work would this be?
Councilmember Rennie, I can't say for certain. I can tell you that it's not standard practice to have internal service funds, so there's not a lot of examples. So we're kind of, once again, going into uncharted waters. There are some cities that do have internal service funds policies, and it's a relatively, I'd say, more of a newer thing. Depends on the level of data that, you're asking 10-year histories, trends, a lot of things, and we have we're gearing up right now for our year end. We have our year end process with all of our payroll and W-2s. We're a very small department. We have strategic priorities coming up in January. We have to get a mid-year budget out to the council in February. We have also all of our plans for all the development, and we have to do our financial forecast for next fiscal year. So that, all that being said, we will, if we have a deadline, say, that was before the next finance committee meeting, then I would expect that the work product would have to be abbreviated in some fashion, because we wouldn't be able to do the level of analysis I think council's probably hoping that we would have. And I would recommend that that we look at this along with our budget, because if we are going to be making a change to any of these targets or any of these policies, it would really improve our budgeting if we knew, okay, we have a new target or a new strategy regarding these internal service funds. We need to incorporate that in next year's 1920 budget. So from my perspective, there isn't a huge rush on this, because we probably have I would prefer, if it was my druthers, to do this probably after our mid-year and do it in the March timeframe. We'll have we have a March to April timeframe when we could probably do a little better analysis on this, and that will roll in from a time perspective real well with our budget efforts as we're getting ready for the 1920 budget, because and somehow we're going to have to shoehorn, if the council's desires to have this go to a finance committee, we may have to adjust or shoehorn a finance committee meeting in that time frame. But I think to try to do this by February under the current workload that we have, we would not be able to support the strategic planning that we wish to do in January, and some of the things that I know are very important to the council.
So as part of my motion, I'm not asking for a rush on this. I'm asking really whether council wants to explore it or not. If they're interested and they want to rush, they can add in, but my motion wouldn't be to rush it. It would be to do it properly.
There is a motion. Do we have a second to the motion? Councilmember Spector.
I have a question and a second. If I can have the motion repeated, please, either by staff or mayor or motion maker.
Okay, again, I'll attempt it, and the maker of the motion can amend as needed. To explore, essentially the motion would be to explore both the internal service funds and all of our reserve funds in aggregate.
And explore them from the risk perspective, and, can we combine or whatever.
Okay, thank you.
I'll second that motion.
We have a motion and a second. Any more comments on this motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
Passes 4-1. I'm going to make a recommendation on this item. I think we've given staff a lot of work. So I would say if there's any more comments, I'm all ears, but I don't know if we should do any more motions. All right. So we will close this item, and I want to take a 5-minute break before our next item, which will be item number 5, pulled from our consent calendar. Thank you.
Call the meeting back to order, and next up is agenda item number 5, pulled from the consent calendar by the Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I pulled this because, thank you for the committee assignments, by the way. But I am going to be beginning in the first week of January schooling, and I am in class on Wednesdays at 5:30 till 6:45. So I've been appointed to the CDAC, which meets Wednesdays at 4:30, the general plan, which meets Wednesdays at 5:30, and the Silicon Valley Clean Energy, which meets Wednesdays at 4 p.m. And I do not want to do a disservice to the town by not being available for the full time. I know that CDAC meets infrequently, and perhaps it would work, but I would have a 4:45. Well, I have to have a 5:15 cutoff. And general plan, I know it meets infrequently, but it's right at my class time. And I don't know when general plan advisory meets. I'm interested in that, but I don't think I can do it if I'm not on the general plan. So, and I have a direct conflict also with this Silicon Valley Clean Energy. So thank you for those assignments, but I do not want to put the town in a position of not having a representative.
All right, thank you for your comments on that. So, Mr. Rennie.
So I'm plenty happy to pick up the Silicon Valley Clean Energy alternate assignment. As you're probably aware, I've been on that committee for, I was a founding member. I was chair when we first started delivering power of it. And I serve on 3 subcommittees, the Finance Committee, the Legislative Committee, and the Risk Oversight Committee. As an alternate, I can continue to participate on those committees. Councilmember Sayak could be the board member as the primary, but I know she has work commitments and probably couldn't serve on subcommittees, so I would be able to help out. I think it would be, I know it would be a disadvantage to the organization to lose me on those committees because of the knowledge I've built up, particularly the Risk Oversight Committee has a lot of technical understanding, so keeping continuity is good for that organization. Since I've been pulled off all the internal town committees, I certainly have time to continue helping on the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority, so I would like to pick up Vice Mayor Jensen's alternate appointment for the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority.
Okay, so to the town manager, procedurally, how do we address this? Do we have to do this with a motion, or do we just, I can say yes?
Yes is fine.
Okay, we will honor Mr. Rennie's request for the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority alternate. So that leaves us with the general plan and the general plan advisory committee.
The General Plan Advisory Committee typically meets at 7 p.m.
On Wednesday?
No, it's been all over, and so we would probably work, Tuesdays, I believe, are the days that we've been meeting most recently.
So if it's at 7 o'clock, I don't have a conflict because my class ends at 6:45. And if I could be on the general plan advisory as already appointed, I would like to do that, provided there's no conflict.
So it appears that there is no conflict, so you can remain on those 2.
Thank you.
And then there was the one.
My concern about the CDAC is that it starts at 4:30, which is not a problem, but when there is a meeting, it's not always predictable that it will end in time for me to get back and do class at 5:30. So I don't want to put the committee in the position of not being able to stay for a full meeting.
Okay. And that was the only other conflict, right?
Correct.
Okay. So on the CDAC, is there anyone on council Councilmember Spector, you are already on there? Are there any other takers?
Mm-hmm.
Seeing none, I will do it if nobody else desires.
We have another option for your consideration. Staff can also manage the agenda. Very rarely do we have more than one item at a time coming to CDAC, but we could essentially let applicants know up front that we can only handle one CDAC item per meeting, and then we should be able to finish by the 5:15 time.
Well, that would be great. So if that's acceptable to the staff and the mayor, that's fine. I just need to be ready to go at 5:30, and so 5:15 should be enough. So thank you for doing that.
So if that is a satisfactory solution, then we will keep it as is. We worked everything out for everybody here. Okay, so we'll close item number 5. I think we got it covered, and we'll move on to item number 6, which is the CAFR. Do we have a staff report?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. A very brief staff report. So tonight you have before you the June 30, 2018 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for your acceptance tonight. The town annually contracts with an independent auditor, Badawi & Associates of Oakland, California. Just completed our audit. Mr. Mitesh Desai is present in the audience. If council wishes to speak to our auditor, he is available. I would like to point out that the CAFR before you tonight has a clean audit opinion. There were no issues. The staff presented the document to the Finance Committee as a draft, and the independent auditor provided an attachment and a presentation of their audit to the Finance Committee. I would stress that this is a somewhat of a technical document. The CAFR is a technical document, so that it must conform with generally accepted accounting principles. It conforms, to the best of our knowledge, to all the GASBs and all the generally accepted auditing standards as required by the independent auditor. In some of the remarks or some of the comments from the Finance Committee, before they could accept it, they wish staff to make certain additional disclosures. Staff has incorporated some additional further disclosures in our transmittal letter, in our management's MD&A, which is the management's discussion and analysis, and also further elaboration in the footnotes to address some of the comments and concerns that were expressed at our recent Finance Committee meeting. Our intention tonight is that council would accept the document, or the CAFR, and accept the clean audit opinion, and accept this as a final report. And I'm available for any questions council might have.
Thank you, Mr. Conway. Vice Mayor.
A couple questions, if I might. I just want to understand this. It's probably not a legal standard, but it's maybe an accounting standard. For acceptance of a CAFR, and I'm equating it in my mind with an EIR, that there's a document and there are legal hurdles, if you will, check marks that it has to do, and as long as it meets those check marks, essentially the body that's looking at it says, okay, you've concluded this section, I see your analysis, etc. For the CAFR, you have to meet the GASB requirements, and you also have to have an independent auditor determine that the facts are fairly presented with no material misstatements. Are those the standards?
That is correct. If we had financial statements were not in, the auditor has given opinion that our financial statements fairly represent our financial activities for the year.
Okay.
Which includes the MD&A is if the MDA was not in conformance with the rest of the financial statements, that the auditor would have to qualify their opinion, and they have not done that.
Okay. Different question. The distribution on the excess is per our existing town policy, correct?
Correct, per our general fund reserve policy, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that is also reviewed by our auditors.
Thank you.
Very carefully.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sort of the same question. I want to understand, because when the motion would say, or the recommendation is accept, is accept limited to the fact that there is an auditor statement and we have read the auditor statement? Is that the extent of accepting?
Well, I believe our current, under the general law city, the requirement is that the city have an annual independent audit performed every fiscal year. That audit has been performed. I'm very pleased to say it was a clean audit, no modified opinion by the auditors. The auditors are here this evening. So essentially, from what my understanding of our ordinance and the general law provisions for cities, is if the audit was performed and it's a clean audit, and the audit was done according to generally accepted auditing standards, then council can accept it.
All right, and then the second question, the next part of the recommendation from the staff is accept a resolution confirming June 30th, 2018 fund balances. Is this saying that we're looking at what has already happened, or are we making some decisions as to what should happen?
Thank you, Councilmember Spector. That resolution that is before you tonight confirms the year-end June 30, 2018 final amounts and how those were allocated under the council's approved general fund reserve policy that was in force as of June 30th, 2018. No decisions about this fiscal year's reserves are made as part of that resolution. So this is the balance that will carry forward into our January strategic objectives discussion. This will be the beginning points.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. So one of the questions that's come up from the public is about how much the MD&A should be audited. We have the GASB 34 that says you're required to have a discussion and you're supposed to be transparent with your discussion and everything. So there's a requirement to do it, but I recall the auditor telling us that he doesn't really audit the MD&A, only to make sure that any statements made in them are correct, not how much clarity there is or how good a job. Is our auditor here that could
yes.
address that question? That would be more appropriate for the auditor to answer, I think.
Sorry, to clarify, our responsibility of the management discussion and analysis is that we are required to make sure that there's some discussion over budget, trends. We verify that the numbers represented in the management discussion analysis are not different from the financial statements. Trends or variances are consistent with what we've noted during the audit. As far as our responsibility goes with this portion of the report. In terms of how much clarification or how much discussion you want to include, the length of the section of the document, that's up to management's discretion. That's why it's called management's discussion analysis. It's not the auditor's discussion analysis where we kind of give you all the information. As long as all the components of the management discussion analysis are there, we would not change our opinion on that.
Thank you.
Any more questions for staff? Councilmember Sayoc.
Yes, actually, so with regard to the CAFR, I understand the legal requirements. And so one of the questions I have from the Finance Committee, and I look to either Finance Committee members or staff to answer. There were some questions that were asked, and I'm looking at page 42 of the CAFR. And there were some large variances. And so the first question that I would ask of staff is, can we, if we would like to change the format for next year so that there are percentages versus actual amounts, that's the first question. Can we do that? Or is this a standard format for all CAFRs? And then the second, could we as council just make a policy for explanation from staff in future reports why there would be significant variances? Based on what I'm reading from the notes and the public comment, those were more the questions. Why were there such significant variances? And so I'd like staff feedback on what you consider significant, 5%, 10%, 7%, and then if you could provide some answers on those variances.
Thank you, Councilmember Sayak. The statement that you were referring to on, I believe, on page 42, that is a prescribed statement. That format is so that type of statement compares from city to city across the nation. So that's, for lack of a better word, more of a boilerplate format that we use as part of our financial presentation. Any further elaboration of variances would have to occur at a different part of the document. That could be done at the MD&A. One of the goals we have when we prepare this document is there are different avenues to communicate financial information. The MD&A is supposed to represent a very high level, high summary review of the year. We believe this MD&A does do that. It meets all the standards. If it didn't, our auditors would advise us that we have more work to do. We could elaborate more in another format, such as in the transmittal letter or possibly through our website, or there's many other avenues besides the CAFR. When we get comments back from our award reviewers, they try to limit the length of the MD&A to make it more approachable to the high-level reader, so that we don't go on and on with detail that can be gleaned through other avenues. So we've done our best to keep it at a high level, address all the areas that we feel needed to be addressed, and this is our MD&A would stack up well against any comparable city as far as my professional opinion is concerned, and so I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so it answers that. It does answer. Thank you. And so my other question was, the Finance Committee had asked for more elaboration. You've done that. It's the redlined version. And were there any specifics that were asked by committee members of these variances, or was it simply more discussion on the MDA and other paragraphs that I see here?
I don't want to speak for the Finance Committee, but I do think there was a general interest in understanding more of why there were variances. We had a good year in that and I think it's been put out in one of our public comments, that our general fund had a $5 million favorable fund balance. Year-end results were $5 million to the good, as opposed to a planned use of reserves. And so we've done our best to talk in very high-level terms of how that happened, but essentially we had $2 million of savings through our budgeted salaries and benefits, and then we had an approximate $3 million of revenues above our mid-year budget estimates. That occurred. I have details of all that, but that once again would be a very lengthy discussion, not really appropriate for the MD&A unless council directed us to get into that granular level of detail. Of the $2 million savings in the salaries and benefits, nearly half of that was from our police department, public safety area, and public works. And those could be largely due to vacancies, and also we do, on some of our non-safety staff, we do budget at top step, so there will be some savings there, but that wouldn't probably be the significant part of it.
And one more question, if I may. Yeah. So you mentioned the $3 million, and so and this ties into the fund balance resolution in attachment 2. Is this the same $3 million? In May, we had a conversation when we were going through the budget, and we were looking at this $3 million potential, I guess, cost savings, but we had to wait because we had to wait till audited results.
Yes, we had a forecast of favorable, as you remember very well. We had told council that we were expecting to be, quote, in the black for fiscal year 17-18. And we said we'll likely have fund balance available for our January strategic planning process for
Correct.
Council. And I'm happy to report that we will have some fund balance to discuss and for council's prioritization as a result of that.
And so that $3 million that we were talking about in May is actually this 5.2 that's in?
That's a factor, a part of it, yes. There's revenues beyond our well-informed budget estimates.
And so by attachment 2, though, if we approve this resolution, aren't we I don't know if committing's the right word, but aren't we already deciding how that money will be used before we even get into the strategic priority discussion?
Right, it's a little cart before the horse, Councilmember Syak. Under our current independent audit and the way we've been advised by our auditors, so according to our general fund reserve policy as approved by town council last spring, those balances rolled, and so if you would look at your CAFR, you would see you have approximately $14 million in the reserve for capital improvements, which is the reserve of last resort. I believe in our Q&A, if you saw the process of how we allocate year-end positive when we're in the black, that is why we have a $14 million reserve for capital improvements, and we will be bringing that discussion to council and saying, council, how do you feel about this? If we need to change this around, let's say we're going to put $1 million towards unfunded pension obligation or something, we're going to have, I believe town manager believes, we'll be bringing that discussion forward in January for council to look at that. Then we'll make a change to this fiscal year and rearrange those balances based on the various priorities. Or if there's the priority is for street repair and infrastructure, that would be earmarked out of that, 14 million. So that's a future discussion.
And when you say future, that's the January discussion?
Correct.
Okay. But for now, if the resolution in attachment 2 gets approved, it goes into a capital account.
Yes.
And so the discussion in January then would be taking it out of a capital account for other uses.
Yes, because we did tell council that just under the way our audit and the way that our auditor views this, we can't go back retroactively and recommit our balances for other priorities. We have to do it in the current fiscal year. But what I can tell you is that the amounts you see as the various reserves as of June 30, 2018 will not change or touch until council directs us to change them in some other fashion. They will remain as you see them until we get direction from council this fiscal year.
Councilmember Spector.
I don't know if Councilmember Syak is done. All right. I'm going to swing back to the same question because I want to make sure I understand it. One of the recommendations of staff is to approve these attachments. And one of the attachments is the resolution, and the resolution does show capital projects $14,421,203. So if we approve a resolution that puts these various funds in these various categories, how can we change them in January or next year, should that be the will of the council? Because right now, it says they are in these funds.
So basically, the auditor advises that whatever our policies are as of June 30th, 2018, if we have excess money, we must distribute that excess according to council-approved policy. So that's what the table in the resolution does. It says we've got to do our budget stabilization, we've got to do catastrophic, we've got our CalPERS, and then excess goes into capital projects. We know that in January, because we have the excess, you can give us now budget direction to say, it's great that we've got some money to work with, and council may say, as we build the 1920 budget, we want to reduce our PCI, and so put some of that 14 million towards our street repair project. Or council might say, well, we did so well with some of our excess, why don't we put more towards the budget? So then as you set the budget for 1920, you adopt a new resolution, and then the numbers get reallocated. So all of this happens through council action. We really don't have the discretion to change the numbers in the resolution, is really the bottom line. These are audited numbers. They are consistent with policy. You may have future policy reason to move them, but at this point, we have to allocate according to whatever the policies the town had at the time of June 30th.
given that this is thank you. Given that this is a resolution, is there anything that precludes the resolution memorializing the fact that these numbers could change in the next fiscal year?
I would ask our auditor to comment on that.
I believe the resolution is just setting the amounts for the commitments that were previously adopted by council on June 30th. If you have any different commitments, that can always be adopted in the future. Doesn't prevent you from doing that.
So even though it says, whatever it says, 5 million to budget stabilization or 562,000 to open space, that can be revisited in, for example, January of 2019.
Correct. You would have to take the same level of action that you previously took, or your highest level of action.
It would require a resolution approved by council.
All right, thank you.
Vice Mayor?
I'm just going to beat this dead horse one more time. As I understand the discussion, what I am hearing is that essentially what we're being asked to do tonight is accept an accounting exercise. And the accounting exercise has to be done through these general accounting principles, and our CAFR has to be fairly presented, no material misstatements. And so it must conform as an accounting exercise to our current policies, to plug the numbers into our current policies in order to check the boxes for the accounting exercise. Is that correct?
Yes, we could, when we have our...
Yes is good.
Yes.
And then, so once you do that, great. We have our accounting. It's the auditor said your accounting looks great. And now we know in January, when we do our strategic priorities, that we have an extra 4.2. The staff tells us that it's been distributed, 698,000 to pension, 3.7 to capital projects, and budget and stabilization and catastrophic reserves. So you have $4.2 million, and council, how do you want to spend that? We are not now wed to this accounting resolution. Is that correct?
After June 30 of 18, now we're in a new fiscal year and a new resolution can come forward.
Great, thank you.
Any more comments, questions at this time? Councilmember Sayak?
I'm sorry, Mr. Conway. So it's the timing of it then, that's what precludes us from making these decisions. Because we're talking about funds that happen in a different fiscal year, we cannot...
Correct.
Okay. So now, how do we, using Councilmember Jensen's wording, memorialize, how do we know the exact amount that we're talking about? I'm looking at the resolution. It says, whereas there exists an excess balance. So how much exactly is the extra that we're looking at? Is it the 5.3 that I'm looking at on page 42? I heard 14 million. I've heard different amounts. So what exactly is money that this resolution is working with, so that in January we know exactly how much we have available to appropriate?
Well, you can see that the total fund balances of $30,428,684 agree to the if I can get you the right page number, to your total general fund balances that are audited as of June 30, 2018. Can you see the general fund column on your the last part of the resolution? You can see that $30,428,000. That has been allocated under our general fund reserve policy that's in effect as of June 30, and that reflects a change from the prior year's fund balance, which was $29 million some odd dollars. So it's a combination of the year-end results and any other uses of reserve during the budget year, and it's more than just the revenue and expense that you're talking about. There's a few other factors we'd have to detail that for you, but this is once again a schedule we prepare for our auditor to review and have to verify any of those changes from year to year.
Councilmember Spector?
I'm going to continue beating the dead horse. Question of staff. I'm pretty sure I'm on the same page of the resolution as Ms. Syak. So I just want to see if we have a resolution that puts funds in various categories, and the total number of funds under general fund is $30,428,684. Is there anything that would limit this council from reallocating that amount of money, 30 million plus, come January of 2019?
I do not believe so, except for any legally required reserves, and those would be restricted or legally required reserves. But I'm looking here, and I do see one. We have an open space reserve that's for 560. We actually have a stipulation from the Mid-Peninsula Open Space that money only be used for acquisition of open space. So we have some legal obligations on some of these for these amounts. But for the most part, the answer is council can bring forward a new resolution and reallocate and change the general fund reserve policy as council sees best, and then reallocate within a new policy. Yes, you can.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Okay, same dead horse. Is there any reason that the resolution, so looking at, I guess it doesn't have page numbers on it, but it's the top of the second page, whereas there exists an excess balance as of June 30th. And then it goes on. Is there any reason that that paragraph could not be expanded in accord with page 3 of our staff report, that the paragraph that says basic financial statements, pages 31 through 89. There's a sentence that says, presented in this statement is a 4.2 million excess of revenues over expenditures of the fiscal year. The result for this fiscal year provided a source to fund the budget stabilization and catastrophic reserves at 25% of operating expenditures, provide an additional $690,000 of funding to the pension OPEB reserve, and allocate $3.7 million to the capital projects reserve. Is there any reason we couldn't just take that language so that we know exactly what the amount of the excess balance is and then how it got distributed? It's worded a little differently here, but it doesn't call out the 4.2 million. So I don't think that I'm changing any numbers. I'm just expanding on what's the resolution is, so that when the council comes back and looks at that in January, you can say, oh yeah, now I remember that. I can change it.
We'd be happy to make that edit.
And that is not an auditing difficulty?
That would be, that's a clarification we'd be happy to make.
All right, thank you.
No more hands up. We'll go to the public comment. First speaker is Mr. Lee Fagot.
Interestingly enough, listening to the conversation that this council just had, I think I'm going to pass on making a comment other than to say that I'm encouraged to see the kind of questioning coming from the council to learn better the issues around and dealing with the MD&A and setting the right groundwork for 2019 calendar year and the fiscal year starting 2019-2020. So good job. It was interesting to listen to it. And I apologize for earlier this evening where I shot myself in the foot talking about the wrong agenda item. So
we have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
And is that okay with you too, Mr. Mayor?
It's okay with me.
Mr. Fagot, I'm glad you appreciated our conversation. That's a good thing. But you said something about including our discussion of the MD&A. What is it that you heard that you thought was a good thing?
To try and get better definition and clarity to the numbers, to understand the implications for the next year so that you're not binded or bound by or restricted on how you can reallocate and define reallocate funds and define what those funds are being used for. The fact that you're not worried about the calendar year, not the fiscal year, the calendar year ending, but rather you're looking more strategically going forward. That's what's encouraging to me as a citizen.
Thank you.
No more questions. Thank you, Mr. Fagot. Next up, Terry Derrier.
I want to thank the Town Council for the opportunity to express my thoughts to them. I speak as a resident and as a Town Council Finance Committee member. I too appreciate the dialogue and the questions, some of which were hard questions to the town staff. But I also appreciate staff's two-sentence explanation of what that $5 million represented. If that's what the kind of questions that were being asked, and that I don't think you can find in the management discussion and analysis. So I'm going to begin by clarifying a staff comment that item 6 in your staff report. In the background section, it states, the CPA firm prepared the CAFR for the town of Los Gatos. Town staff may believe this, but Mr. Badawi, the engagement partner, doesn't. He made it very clear, if you look at pages 2 and 5 of his report, that he is only reporting or opining on the financial statements. He reiterated this at the Finance Committee meeting, and he specifically stated, similar to the discussion that was presented tonight, that the MD&A was the town's responsibility. He is not opining in that. That's not included in the financial statements. If it was grossly misleading, he would flag it, but he is not opining on it. I also want to indicate that the staff report does not properly reflect the discussion of the Financial Committee at the Finance Committee meeting. The Finance Committee agenda said that the Finance Committee was to recommend to the Town Council to accept the CAFR. The Finance Committee did not accept the CAFR. That includes the financial statements, the MD&A, and other information. They didn't accept it because they felt the MD&A was incomplete, among other things. They gave specific direction to the staff about the areas of our concern. If I had more time, I could go into details, but I have something else I'd like to talk about, which is the letter that is in the communication from residents. All the numbers used there are from the CPA's presentation. It's the best presentation of whether the town is doing, how the town is doing, if it's better off this year than it was a year ago. If you look at page 14, it presents the cost of town services, net of reimbursements, to town tax revenue. 2 years ago, the revenue exceeded the net services by $4.7 million. In 2018, the net cost of services was greater than the tax revenue. It's not keeping up. How much time do I have?
You are out of time, but we'll see if council has questions for you. We have a question from Councilmember Sayak.
Yeah.
If you could just state your last statement again, what's not keeping up with what?
Town revenues are not keeping up with the net cost of town services. There was over a $4.7 million swing in the last 2 years. It's on page 14 of the CPA's report.
Okay, so this may sound very basic, but please tell me why I should care.
Well, if our primary revenue stream is from various tax revenues, that's the most predictable. So we want that to cover our net services, the net cost of services. We charge for some of those services. So we have fallen behind by $4.7 million in the last 2 years, according to the CPA's report. To me, that says it's a weaker financial condition than we've had in the past.
Okay, so that makes sense now. May I ask another question about, so I read your public comments, and if you, I'm looking at it now, and there were also some comments on the payments made to CalPERS. If you could just explain that to me a little bit about, and I'll also ask Director Conway, is there, you mentioned payments to OPEB versus pensions.
Right.
Now, and one is growing larger than the other. And so is it your opinion that we should be allocating those payments in a different way?
Yes. The comment I made was that the unfunded liability for pensions is growing. The unfunded liability for OPEB is shrinking. The interest rate on pensions is 7.15%. The interest rate on the OPEB is 3.75, a lower interest rate. Why aren't we paying off our higher debt, our higher interest cost debt instead of paying off the OPEB?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Derrier. Next is Philip Keown.
See that? Good. Okay, thank you. Just to build off the comments from Terry, I want to be very, very clear. And the auditor is here, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but he has not opined upon the MD&A that is responsibility of the staff and the town council for its robustness and completeness. He's only issued an opinion on the financial statements, including the footnotes. If I'm wrong, I'd like for him to clarify. My concern is this. The MD&A is not complete. There is one sentence in all of it that talks about budget versus actual. That's unacceptable. In no definition can anyone conclude that that gives the average citizen an understanding of what's going on. So here is the financial statement comparing budget versus actual. I've circled some just obvious things that just pop out. Why is the charges for services 1.3 million favorable? I'm sure we know why. Disclose it. Why is public safety $1 million under our budget? When we just passed a sales tax, we're supposed to be paying more for public safety, and we're not even meeting the budget. Is it because we don't have enough people? Disclose it. And here's the kicker. The budget is supposed to be a management tool. This town staff presented to the town council an original budget that said we're going to have a deficit of $974,000. We then revised it and said, oops, there's going to be a deficit of $1.7 million. Fast forward, everyone says, fantastic. We actually had a surplus of 3.5. That's a 5.2 million swing. I don't think by anyone's definition that the budget is any type of management control document, which gets to my second point. This is the sum of the explanation of the budget versus actual. And it's only talking about expenses. It doesn't talk about the elements. And the concern I have is that we are told that this 2.4 million favorability in total expenses, 1.9 million of it is because of staff vacancies, and we've added to this actual staff costs. This is blatantly misleading. Let me explain why. When the staff, let's say that I hired you for $100,000. I then go and build a budget, and I budget your salary for $200,000. And at the end of the year, I come back and say, fantastic, I've saved you $100,000 because I didn't pay you what the budget was. That's misleading. I believe in this financial statement, there is at least 1.5 million of excess budget that was built in that's a hidden savings. Just disclose it. There's no reason why the staff can't tell us exactly what happened here, and they have refused to. My recommendation, send this back to the Finance Committee. They have not approved that. This is the policy, and let them opine on this document.
Councilmember Spector has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One of the reasons I was asking the questions I was asking at the beginning is because I wanted to get straight in my head, firm in my mind, the timing. You're talking about things that you see that are inaccurate, that it doesn't really reflect. We say we're going to cost $1 million for police officers or $2 million, and it costs $1 million, and so we show it's $1 million in savings. Whatever it is, isn't this something that has already occurred and it is actually reflected appropriately in the CAFR? Aren't you really saying, I want it to be different in the future, not that it is inaccurate in the past?
To be very clear, the management discussion analysis, which is a prescribed section in the CAFR, you have to have this. Its function is to disclose what's gone on in that year in these financials. And one of the things you have to talk about is budget versus actual variances. There is a list of variances. There is no disclosure, no discussion explaining any of this in this CAFR. Therefore, I believe this CAFR fails on the most basic tests around transparency and disclosure so the average citizen understands what actually occurred.
What if this council accepted, whatever the word is, whatever the verb is, accepted the CAFR exclusive of the MDA?
You can't do that because the document stands as an integrated document. You have to take it as a whole. That's why the GSAB has put out very prescriptive discussion around adequacy of MD&A. And as Terry said, if there was a material, something that was actually factually a number reported in the MDA that didn't get reflected in the financials, the auditors would reflect that. But it's the management's responsibility to be transparent and give a full and adequate disclosure around these variances. And I'm a professional finance person. I don't have a clue as to why, and these are pretty significant numbers. Why did the police safety underspend the budget by $1 million? Please explain it.
And so you're saying, and I'm just taking this as one piece of input, you're saying that this council cannot accept the financial document exclusive of the MDA and the town manager's letter?
Correct. It's impossible because the document is in its entirety. And you, as the authoritative body for this town, have a fiduciary responsibility. This is an important document. Creditors rely on it. We have public debt. Suppliers rely on it. Prospective job applicants would rely on it. Citizens rely on it. It's your job at the end of the day to say, on average, on a reasonable basis, have we disclosed what's gone on in the past year? That's what the MD&A section does. And I submit to you that one sentence, that's it. That's the only sentence in this whole document that discusses budget versus actual. But yet, we have a whole bunch of itemized items that sit there and explain how the budget changed. It's just not equal weighting. You have to disclose these variances and what drove it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Next speaker is Jack Fauneda.
Good evening. I am addressing item 6, subject B, which is asking you to approve a resolution to distribute the fund balance from June 30th. We are estimating that the total excess balance is about $6,973,000. As you can see, forgot my, is there a laser pointer here? No. Okay, I brought one, but it's back there. Anyway, we're estimating that it's a total excess balance of $6,972,000. And my proposal to you would be to take a look at the this money with a very high regard for our pension debt that has cost us nearly $12 million in interest just this year alone, and that doesn't count interest debt, thank you, for the OPEB. If we put the $6,148,000 towards capital projects, that will raise our capital projects account to levels that are nice but completely unnecessary. Come on, baby, there we go. So there's capital reserve projects, $6,000,001. This is the council's opportunity to send the message that you are serious about paying down debt that is accelerating and costing us a fortune in interest every year. My request would be that you send the excess funds information back to the Finance Committee and have them come up with their recommendation to you. Having bypassed the Finance Committee to approve the CAFR was, in my mind, a slap in the face. We will lose these people if we don't show them the respect that they deserve. Not only did they not get to approve the CAFR, but their request for more information in the MD&A was absolutely ignored. Lastly, all of us, the Finance Committee included, were told that we would have a robust discussion about the excess funds from 2018. That hasn't happened either. As I mentioned, if the Finance Committee is seen as a titular group of Los Gatos citizens who are ignored, they're going to go away. That will hurt the credibility of the council and the town. Using this example on the screen, our cash position after giving $10 million to CalPERS would still be about $4 million above the 2014 levels. The Internal Services Fund could contribute $3,162,000, which is well within their 9-year average, and will save a ton of money that we spend senselessly on interest costs. So I'm strongly suggesting that we make a lump sum payment of $10 million as recommended by your consultant, Bartels. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Question from Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The numbers that you have up there are different than the numbers we have in our CAFR. And if you were listening to the discussion prior to the council meeting or this agenda item being reported on and discussed, the numbers that we have in our CAFR are numbers that have been adopted by policy or some other methodology by this council. And so our budget at this point is not supposed to be changing it. Putting aside whether I agree or disagree or whether anybody agrees or disagree, what do you think about that position? That this CAFR is supposed to show what exists now and what existed last year, not anything that we want to change in the future?
I'm very much for showing this year and last year, and in discussions I've had with some council people, one of my recommendations is that we put percentages by all of these numbers. It helps you to understand, and as has been said by previous speakers, if you have a budget that has percentages there, you get an idea of how close you are on budgeting. Let's use 5%, and if your budget's 10% over or 10% too high, 10% too low, you can see it as council people. Right now, you're just seeing numbers. I think it's very difficult for you to get a good grasp on these financials with the information at hand.
I didn't, my question was not clear, so let me try again. You have currently proposed, and then you have my recommendation.
Yes.
Your recommendation as staff as represented is not consistent with adopted council policies. How then, assuming that's true, how then would council move to accept your recommendations if they are inconsistent with what we have previously adopted?
Well, my understanding is, and there's a little bit of new understanding that came tonight listening to some of the different conversations, but I believe in January you could set up a new committed fund that would pay pension debt, and that would be the $6,838,079. All
right, thank you.
No more questions. Thank you. So that concludes the public hearing portion. Let's go back to council. Ms. Pravetti?
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, if you will, there were several comments made during the public comment period, and several questions that the council members asked of members of the public. I think it would be useful to have our finance director and/or auditor also answer some of those questions. And the ones that I noticed was the point about revenues not keeping up with expenses, and the opinion that that means that the town has a weaker financial condition. I can just comment that we did in fact disclose in the CAFR that we fully know that our pension costs are increasing, potentially as much as 30 to 40%. So that has been disclosed contrary to public comment. The comment that budget versus actual must be discussed in the MD&A. We've been told by our auditor that we cannot repeat information that's already contained in the financial statement. So we have to be very selective in terms of our discussion. But if it is the will of the council to have more discussion on things, we would be happy to do so in other mechanisms, as Mr. Conway said earlier. And then there are probably other items that Mr. Conway wants to speak about. But let's start with the comment about the weaker financial condition.
Thank you. I'm going to be referring to one of our public comments regarding the $4.7 million. This was a presentation that our auditor prepared for our finance committee, and they were looking at total town revenues in specific fiscal year. I think it was a 2-year period compared to total town expenditures. What gets really difficult for the public to understand is when you just say, oh, there's a $4.7 million of revenue below expenditures. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, because those particular years that the auditor was looking at, I had the committee member been listening very carefully to the auditor. He did qualify his comment when he was making the presentation, and that I want to stress that in those 2 years I looked at, we had significant project expenditures on Almond Grove. As council remembers, all those expenditures occurred from savings in prior years that council directed to Almond Grove. So in that 2-year window of looking at total town revenues against total town expenditures, your expenditures should be substantially more because you did all this infrastructure work. You didn't pay for it with current revenue. In those 2 years, you paid for it from the blue bar, the fund balances. So very important, and that wasn't made clear, and I couldn't let that stand. So, and the auditor did qualify his comment to us. Regarding the disclosures that, regarding the MD&A, we feel they are appropriate. They are, auditor also, if, as the auditor has stated, if we had made any misleading or comments or statements, the auditor would be forced to modify his or her opinion of our financial statements. We stand by those discussions. Regarding the budget to actual statements that Mr. Keane presented, those were taken right from our CAFR. Those are accurate. There is a statement that shows revenues budget to actuals that show, and they're fairly, he pointed out, I think, charges for services as an example. We had an excess of $1.5 million above budget. I just quickly looked at that this afternoon, and this is the granular level of detail that you just don't write in an MDA, but we received, and our budget office, I think there's been remarks about, well, the adequacy of our budget office in terms of estimating our revenues. We received very late in June some significant payments on from our development project on the North 40 that staff at the time of the mid-year could not tell us when when that land use and those approvals would occur. So we had some very late revenue that came in. But then to try to put that into an MDA on June 26th, the developer walked in and a revenue. This is the kind of granular discussion we try not to get into the weeds on in our MD&A. We can, however, explain those types of variances very adequately, but probably not. I wouldn't recommend the MD&A as the forum for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. For Mr. Conway, I was listening to what the auditor was saying, and he was talking about on this issue of accepting the comprehensive financial report, and he was talking about these numbers in the financial statement. Is there any problem or issue with this council accepting the financial report exclusive of the MDA and staff report, staff letter?
No, I believe that these, I would agree with Mr. Keene's comment that this should be a complete document, the MD&A, the letter of transmittal, and the audit opinion and financial statements and the other required supplementary information are all part of one document, so it stands on its own as a whole document.
Understood, and I understood that that's what was stated in the testimony. But from a legal point of view, what is it that we have to accept in order to get past this motion tonight and get into January of 2019?
This document needs to comply with all of the requirements, all of the different general accounting standards, all the GFOA standards. In fact, these documents get reviewed by our auditor to make sure all of those standards are met. We have a clean audit letter essentially saying that we have done that. If there are, and we have, in addition, addressed the issues that came from the Finance Committee. You have a red line version that clarified and added language to further elaborate within the constraints of all of those rules. We understand fully that there's more curiosity about why certain numbers are the way they are, and we're happy to describe that. This is not the mechanism to do it. We could do it on our website, we could do it in the and certainly I think what we're learning most is that there's a lot of great ideas in terms of how can we make our budget document more useful to the council and to our public going forward. So we already have a lot of great ideas about how we can really disclose a lot of good stuff for all of you with our next budget. But tonight, the issue is the CAFR. And if the council has specific changes that you would like to see, we are happy to do those as part of your motion to accept. So far this evening, aside from the one suggestion to the resolution, we have not heard any specifics, and at this point, we really need to get to specifics.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you for your patience, Mr. Mayor. I understand that, and I understand that we will be coming up with a motion pretty soon, but my question is, from a legal point of view, we need to accept the CAFR, and does accepting the CAFR mean that we, by law, have to accept the MDA and the manager's letter?
Yes, it's one document.
All right, thank you.
Vice Mayor.
I'd like to try a motion. My motion is that we, given the discussion about exactly the document that we're looking at, that it reflects a fiscal year that is passed and is taking audited numbers and determining whether or not they conform with general accounting principles, whether they conform with GFOA rules, and whether or not they fairly present with no material misstatements the state of our fiscal year close, which is, as I understand it, and that we have an auditor who has told us that, in fact, this document does that. With respect to the MD&A, we can engage in editing exercises. We have gotten a red line, which is included, which my motion would include. But a difference of opinion about how a written document should look is not a basis, in my opinion, to accept it or not. We have an auditor who has said that it does meet the standards. Someone thinks it ought to be more detailed. I might think it ought to be 3 sentences. But we do disclose that information elsewhere, and in fact, we have an auditor that says that it is adequate. So I am not, this motion will not include any kind of exclusion of any portion of the document. In addition, this motion will the motion is to approve a resolution confirming the June 30th, 2018 fund balances in accordance with fiscal year 27-18 final audit and the Town Council General Fund Policy, with the understanding, with the earlier suggestion that the paragraph which indicates that we have an excess balance be modified in accord with The last paragraph of page 3 of our staff report indicating the distribution of that excess, as I read earlier, and I think Ms. Pravetti has notes of it, so that is reflected in the accounting statement, which I am, the reason I'm making this motion is that this is an accounting statement that has been audited, and with the understanding that not part of the motion, but with the understanding that that fund balance is subject to review in January when we come to our strategic priority, hence the inclusion of those numbers in this resolution, which I assume will be brought back to us. So that's the motion.
Councilmember Rennie?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to second the motion with some comments. If you remember, this was actually on consent, and the purpose of our looking through the CAFR really is to make sure that the auditor has done their job, and it's really about, and the auditor's job is to look through the statements and make sure there's no material deficiencies and everything is done correctly, and that seems very clear to us. We've gotten into a lot of discussion, particularly from the public, about something that I don't really think applies to the approval of the CAFR. It applies more to the way we think about our next budgeting exercise, and a lot of it really has to do with, well, there are two things we talked about earlier about how much should our fund balances be, but the second one is about when we're thinking about budgeting, should we be thinking about the years before budget, or should we be thinking about the year before's actual, and some discussion of what happened maybe the year before, so we could understand what might happen in the year coming, and knowing that we're going to have some excess, should we plan for that ahead of time versus just pretend that there's no excess and then whoops, there's a surprise, we got an excess, and then we do something with it. I think this is all about a budget time discussion, not a CAFR discussion. So for that reason, I'm seconding the motion.
Other comments? Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to support the motion also on the basis that of the auditor's statement that he accepted the document. So on the basis of that acceptance, I will support the motion.
Councilmember Sack?
Quick question of staff first, and then some comments. So the discussion that we had here tonight, I find it fascinating because we're always learning something. And all the questions on the variances that Director Conway provided, they answer all the questions. And so my question to Director Conway is, yes, this is a boilerplate that's on page 42, but are there ways for next year for us to change at least the narrative so that, knowing that there are some questions on budgets to actuals and those variances, can you create the narrative so that you can anticipate when those discrepancies are and provide some of those answers up front, similar to what you have on page 26, the budget to budget variances, but make it budget to variance so that we have a better understanding, and so it's not always a discussion that's happening during a live council meeting versus us having the ability to read it beforehand and then ask the questions.
Yes, Councilmember Sack, that's a great question, and yes, we can do that, and possibly a more appropriate spot for that would be in the transmittal letter. We have less restrictions in that area. We can broaden our scope of discussion, and I have definitely, and we, I think as a team, have heard there is an increased desire to get more transparency and more explanation. Just like it's interesting. It's when you're dealing with large numbers, you tend to want to just get the audit done and get everything completed and get the facts out there. And we work so hard to get this document right. And there's always ways to improve it. And I hear the comments from the public as we need more. Your CAFR's great. It's great results for the year, but we'd like to really understand how we got to this point, and I think we can help the public understand that better in the future.
Okay, and so given that response, and again, I leave the way that information is shared to you and to the town manager, but again, given the discussion that we had tonight, I think a lot of the questions that were raised during public comments in the correspondence have been answered, and I feel comfortable approving it as
Mr. Mayor, the attorney and I would like to just call to your attention that on attachment 2, which is the draft resolution, at the bottom of the page, there are 2 whereas statements that were erroneously included in this resolution. They pertained to the prior year's CAFR. We apologize for their inclusion. But if this is going to move forward, we would recommend the deletion of the paragraph that begins, whereas in prior years, the council appropriated funds in a deferred revenue deposit account. Last year, we had to make that modification, and we did. So it's still accurate because it was prior years, but it's kind of redundant to state it again this year. And then the last paragraph on that first page has to do, again, with that deferred revenue and its reclassification. And that's, again, that was old news because we took care of those issues last year. So it's a technicality. We apologize for the error.
Duly noted. Vice Mayor?
I just wanted to formally modify my motion to indicate that I'm going to number the paragraphs on the draft resolution. And if I count the numbers of the whereases, the paragraphs that Ms. Pravetti was talking about are my paragraphs 5 and 6 on page 1. So my motion would be as before, but with specifically deleting paragraphs 5 and 6 on attachment 2 per Ms. Pravetti's comments.
It's okay with a seconder.
Thank you. Motion and seconder. So, seeing no further comments, we'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. So that closes out item number 6. We move on to council matters. We'll start with Council Member Sayak.
Thank you. Just wanted to highlight, since our last public meeting, I did represent the town with our VTA State Route 85 Policy Advisory Board. As in previous meetings, there's ongoing discussions of how to provide funds for an alternative mass transit study along Highway 85, and no decision was made.
Thank you. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Since our last council meeting, the Finance Committee met, if you're surprised about that, and we discussed the CAFR and reserves. The Conceptual Development and Advisory Committee met, and we considered or gave input on a mixed-use development on the boulevard that would include, if it goes forward, the implementation of the boulevard plan. And then the GPAC met, and it was basically a short meeting, and we gave input and an overview of the issues that to be included in the general plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor.
I have nothing to report.
Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. I've kind of shortened mine in the number of things I'm going to talk about, but lengthened a little bit where I think there's things of interest to the council. So the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority board approved this past month an extensive decarbonization strategy and a program roadmap, along with allocating $6 million over the next 2 years to achieve this, to work towards this strategy. And the strategy includes a very aggressive goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 50% below 2015 levels for our service area, which is all the cities in the county except for San Jose, Palo Alto, and Santa Clara. In order for SVCEA to reach these goals, the member agencies being us, are going to have to work closely with them and support their program efforts. So we, the town, should be seeing some things coming to us from them, asking to help. So sort of a little more specifically, for example, in the built environment, Los Gatos should participate in developing REACH codes that support building electrification and EV charging. Silicon Valley Clean Energy will also be developing model policies that Los Gatos can use and other cities can use to streamline community electrification. For electric mobility, Silicon Valley Clean Energy will be developing an EV charging infrastructure strategy and plan to promote community-wide EV infrastructure readiness. Silicon Valley Clean Energy is also planning to provide grant offerings to address market gaps in multi-unit dwellings for EV charging. Silicon Valley Clean Energy will also be planning to support member cities and commercial customers to electrify their vehicle fleets, all very relevant to us. Second item that I think is important to Los Gatos and the West Valley is in my role as alternate to the VTA board, I attended as a board member. There was a very long meeting. We started at 5:30 and went past midnight. Things of significance was there was a lot of communication from the unions during verbal communications claiming VTA was not negotiating in good faith. There was some threats of strike. There was an agenda item that was a long discussion about how to close VTA's operating budget gap with a recommendation from a subcommittee that was accepted by the board. That discussion was more than an hour. Basically, VTA dodged a bullet with Prop 6 failing. That would have put another $20 million deficit on their operating budget. And the key things were the recommendations how to fill the gap included not increasing service hours planned for the next generation. And if you recall this discussion from a year or more ago now, the next generation was going to occur when the BART opened. They're going to change their network to try to go more towards moving people versus coverage, more ridership versus coverage. And at the time, we almost lost some routes in Los Gatos and some of the other West Valley cities. What they ended up doing was increasing the total number of service hours from what they are now in order to keep some of that coverage. The recommendation is to keep the number of, from this committee now, is to keep the number of service hours that exist now when we move into the next network. What that means is they're going to be moving towards a 90-10 instead of an 85-15 coverage, a ridership to coverage model. In other words, they're planning to reduce the coverage. So I would expect routes in Los Gatos and the West Valley to be targeted again. So this is something we need to be thinking about. The other place that they had, I should say that their operating budget deficiency is about $25 million. So they're trying to fill it with these several things, the one I mentioned, and another one would be $9 million that they call operating efficiency improvements. What that means wasn't completely clear, but you might read into it cuts in staff or reduced salary increases or things of that sort. And then at the end of the night, we went into closed session to discuss labor negotiations on top of all this that was going on. So it's interesting times at VTA. One thing may be somewhat interested for those interested in land use at LAFCO. There was an annexation proposed by Morgan Hill to annex land for a Catholic high school. We ended up not approving the annexation, and I voted, actually, it was interesting, I voted against the approval and I voted against the denial because I thought we should have continued it, and I laid out kind of a roadmap for what would make the annexation successful or LAFCO able to accept that. Included 8 bullets, which basically focused Morgan Hill on showing that they were serious about ag preservation, because the whole annexation is about whether the key to opening up all the prime farmland to more annexation, or whether this would be a last annexation. And their general plan, their urban growth boundary, and their capital infrastructure plan don't look like this is the last annexation. So that's it for my report.
Thank you. Manager Matters?
Thank you. Just wanted to inform the council that the town today learned that it is receiving almost $1 million in grant funding from CalPERS. This is a 100% grant to allow us to fix our guardrails townwide, and I wish the council happy holidays. Thank you.
CalPERS or Caltrans?
I'm sorry, Caltrans. Thank you.
They're giving us money back.
All right. Well, with that said, happy holidays, everybody. This meeting is adjourned.